Hello everyone, I'm the DreamTeller and I'm here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I realized something was wrong on my third night in that apartment. I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep when I noticed thin cracks on the wall across from me. They weren't there the night before. They ran in jagged lines that seemed to trace some pattern. At first I blamed the poor lighting. I got up, turned on the lamp and stared at the wall. The cracks were definitely there. They looked like they had formed recently, and I felt a jolt of worry in my stomach. I tried to shrug it off. The building was old and old buildings have cracks. I remember telling myself to calm down, but my mind wouldn't settle. I had moved into that place because the rent was cheap. The building was made of these dark stones that gave it a grim look. The lobby had uneven tiles, and the hall smelled musty. My apartment was on the third floor. It had thick walls and small windows, so it felt cramped, especially at night. The first thing I noticed when I came in was the heavy front door. It squeaked whenever I opened it, and the hinges felt stiff. I tried putting some oil on them, but it didn't help much. Every time I came home, I had that loud squeak greeting me. The bedroom was big enough for a bed, a dresser, and a small desk. The walls had a rough gray tone. I noticed some scuff marks here and there, but nothing major when I first moved in. The landlord told me the place was structurally sound, just old and in need of a little renovation. He said the stones were from some old quarry, and that the building had been around for decades. I didn't ask many questions. I just wanted somewhere cheap. That third night, I leaned in close to the wall and ran my fingers over the cracks. They felt shallow. I let out a sigh of relief. I figured I could patch them up with some filler and paint, and everything would be fine. I went back to bed and tried to ignore the strange shapes I saw in those lines. When I woke up the next morning, I went straight to the wall. The cracks were still there, and in the daylight they looked faint. I told myself I had overreacted. I went to work and tried not to think about them. When I got home that evening, the hallway smelled damp. I heard the neighbor across the hall muttering about a leak. I stepped into my apartment, dropped my coat on a chair, and went to the bedroom. I flicked on the light and felt my heart rate jump. The cracks looked more pronounced. They seemed to stretch a bit longer, almost like they'd grown during the day. I stood there staring at them, wondering if I was imagining things. I pressed my ear against the wall, but I only heard silence. I knocked on it, and it sounded solid. I decided to grab some spackling paste and a putty knife from the corner store. By the time I got back, it was close to midnight. I put some plastic sheets down and started filling those cracks. It felt good to take action. I smoothed the paste, making sure it covered every line I could see. Then I wiped the excess, waited for it to dry, and added another thin layer. I finished around 1:00 a.m. My hands were tired, and I just wanted to sleep. I didn't see any more cracks, so I felt a small sense of relief. When I woke up the next morning, I went straight to the wall. The filler looked fine, no sign of new damage. I tapped it. It felt solid. I got dressed, left for work, and felt like I had resolved the problem. That night, though, something started to feel off again. I got home around 8 p.m. and headed to the kitchen to heat a frozen dinner. As I was waiting for the microwave to finish, I had this uneasy feeling. I glanced at the bedroom doorway and saw a faint glow. It looked weak, but I was sure I saw some kind of light. My mind started racing, and I felt a tightness in my chest. I walked into the room and saw a dim, pale shine coming from the wall where I had patched those cracks. I stepped closer and noticed that the lines were back. This time they looked thinner, but somehow deeper. They formed shapes that reminded me of markings I'd seen in old pictures of tombs or something like that. I felt my pulse pounding in my neck. I turned on the overhead light and that faint glow disappeared. The cracks were still there, though. I reached out to touch them. The surface felt rough, and a thin layer of the filler crumbled against my fingers. It fell to the floor in a fine dust. I couldn't believe it. I had just patched those lines the night before. I tried to brush off the dust and see if maybe I had done a sloppy job. But the cracks had definitely reappeared, and they were forming that same strange pattern I'd seen before. I stepped back and stared at them. I felt a cold sweat on my forehead. My hands felt clammy, and my stomach twisted. I heard my own breathing, loud and uneven. I considered calling the landlord, but it was late, and I didn't feel like he would believe me. I sat on the bed, turned off the overhead light, and watched the wall. After a few minutes in the dark, I started to see a faint shine again. It was barely visible at first, but my eyes adjusted. I saw small flickers, almost like a weak glow around the edges of each line. I stood up and paced around. I didn't want to stay in the bedroom. I grabbed my blanket and tossed it on the couch in the living room. I tried to sleep there. All night, I kept thinking I heard soft creaks coming from the walls. I'd sit up, look around, and see nothing. By dawn, I felt exhausted. I had barely slept. I decided to call the landlord that morning, even though it was early. I left a message explaining that there were cracks in my walls that seemed to get worse at night. I asked him to send someone to check it out. He called me back during my lunch break and told me he'd come by in a few days. I wanted him to come sooner, but he said he was busy. He suggested I keep an eye on it and make sure there were no leaks. I tried to argue, but he told me it was probably just normal settling. I couldn't get him to come earlier, so I decided to handle it myself until then. That evening, I went to the hardware store and got more supplies. I got a stronger patching compound, a better putty knife, and some primer. I grabbed a small flashlight too, in case I needed to look behind the walls or check for any hidden gaps. When I got back, I put everything on the floor in the bedroom and turned on all the lights. I tried to see if there was any sign of moisture or mold. The wall seemed dry. I tapped on it in different spots, listening for a hollow sound. Everything sounded normal, except for a few spots near the cracks that sounded slightly different, but not exactly hollow. I scraped away the old filler and cleaned the area. The cracks seemed deeper than before. I stuffed some filler in there, making sure to push it in as much as I could. I applied the new patching compound in layers, letting each one dry. It took me a couple of hours. My arms were sore by the time I was done. I let out a long breath and decided to take a shower before checking it again. I showered with the door open, listening for strange noises. The entire time, my nerves were on edge. After the shower, I went into the bedroom with the flashlight and turned off the overhead light. I stood there in the dark, aiming the beam at the patched area. The filler was white and smooth. I saw no cracks, no glow, nothing. I started to relax. I left the flashlight on the dresser and sat on the bed. I must have drifted off for a while because I woke up to a cold sweat. I heard this tiny clicking sound, like something shifting. I blinked, trying to figure out if I was still asleep. My heart thudded in my chest. I reached for the flashlight and shined it on the wall. The patch looked intact, but I could swear I saw a hairline line forming right where I had just patched everything. I crawled closer and saw the faint crack. It was so thin, I could barely see it, but it was there. My throat felt tight. I pushed my finger against it and a bit of filler flaked off. Underneath, the old crack was there, still shaped in that strange pattern. My breath caught. I felt panic building, but I forced myself to stay calm. I stood up, walked into the living room, and grabbed my phone. I called the landlord again and left another message. Then I sat on the couch, staring into the dark hallway, trying to keep my thoughts from spiraling. I listened for more sounds. I heard the occasional groan of the pipes, the hum of the fridge, the faint buzz of the streetlight outside my window. I didn't hear anything coming from the bedroom, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the cracks were growing, even if I wasn't looking at them. My mind kept going back to how they had that weird glow at night, how they formed shapes that looked more intentional than random. The next morning, I checked the wall again. The crack was longer. I tried to push some filler into it again, but it didn't stick well. It almost felt like the wall was rejecting it. I brushed off the loose bits and felt a chill when I noticed that the lines underneath looked darker, as if the stone itself was exposed. I took a picture with my phone, hoping to have some proof for the landlord. The patterns in the crack looked even more pronounced in the photo. I went to work and spent the day feeling uneasy. I thought about going to a friend's place, but I didn't have any close friends in town. I had moved here for a job and hadn't socialized much yet. That evening, I considered sleeping in a motel, but I decided against it. I told myself I needed to keep an eye on those cracks. If something was structurally wrong with the building, I had to see it firsthand and get the landlord to fix it fast. I got home, opened the door, and felt a cold draft in the hallway. It was weird because it was summer, and the building usually felt stuffy. I unlocked my apartment and stepped inside. The living room looked normal, but when I flipped on the bedroom light, my mouth went dry. The cracks had spread across a larger section of the wall. The pattern was clearer, and there was an odd sheen to it. It wasn't bright. It was more like a dull, eerie reflection. I moved closer and noticed a slight pulsation. I can't explain it well, but it looked like the edges of the cracks shifted or quivered. My head felt light, and I had trouble focusing. I set down my bag, grabbed my flashlight, and shined it on the wall. The beam picked up a faint glimmer in those lines, like something in there was reflecting the light. I heard a soft, scraping sound. It made the hair on my arms stand up. I took a step back. My heart pounded so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I swallowed a lump in my throat and stared at the cracks. I felt this urgent need to leave, but I also felt stuck. I couldn't just abandon my apartment. I heard a knock on the door. I jumped. My pulse spiked and I rushed to the living room. It was my neighbor from down the hall. He asked if I had seen any signs of a leak because he'd found water damage in his unit. I shook my head and told him there was no leak, just some strange cracking. He asked if he could see it, so I let him in. I led him to the bedroom and pointed at the wall. It was all there, plain as day, but I didn't see any glow at that moment. He squinted and said it looked like typical cracks in an old building. I tried to show him the part that seemed to shift, but he just nodded and said maybe the landlord could fix it. He didn't seem impressed or worried. After he left, I felt more isolated than ever. I checked the time. It was almost midnight. I paced around, deciding if I should sleep on the couch again. Then I heard a soft rumble from the wall. It sounded like stones grinding together. I froze. My body felt tense and I could feel sweat trickling down my back. I didn't see any movement, but I sensed a vibration under my feet. I grabbed my phone and dialed the landlord, but it went straight to voicemail. I hissed a few curses under my breath and hung up. I tried to stay awake. I made coffee, turned on the TV, and kept one eye on the bedroom. Every so often I heard faint clicks. Around 2 a.m., I peeked inside and saw a dim light shining through the cracks. My stomach lurched. I walked over slowly, shining my flashlight. The cracks had widened enough that I could slide the tip of my finger into one of them. The edges felt sharp. I jerked my hand back. I noticed a slight glow coming from deep inside, like there was something embedded in the stone. I felt a surge of dread in my chest. I spent the rest of the night on the couch, barely dozing off. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard more shifting. At one point, I jumped up because I could have sworn something was knocking on the wall, but when I checked, I didn't see anything moving. My reflection in the living room mirror looked exhausted and pale. By morning, I had decided to leave. I didn't care about the lease, I just wanted out. I stuffed some clothes and essentials in a bag and got ready to go. But before I left, I went to the bedroom to take one last look. The cracks covered nearly half the wall, branching into more patterns. A section near the ceiling had started to crumble, leaving small bits of stone on the floor. The sight made my heart pound. I felt certain that if I stayed any longer, something terrible would happen. I grabbed my bag, slammed the door behind me, and rushed downstairs. As I passed through the lobby, I heard a low groan from the walls. I didn't look back. I left the building and felt a weight lift off my chest the moment I stepped onto the sidewalk. I still don't know what was behind those cracks or why they kept expanding. I didn't care. I only cared about getting away. I checked into a cheap motel that morning and planned to fight with the landlord later. Every time I think about it, I feel a chill that won't go away. I can't explain it, and I don't want to. That's the end of the story as far as I'm concerned. Whatever was creeping through those cracks can stay there. I have no intention of going back. I still remember the exact moment I spotted that beat-up camera. It was sitting on a dusty shelf in a cramped antique store, tucked between random trinkets and old postcards. It looked like nobody had touched it in years. The thing drew me in right away, even though I wasn't in the market for a camera at all. But something about that dull metal body and the scratched lens made me curious. I asked the old shop owner if it worked, and he just shrugged, said something about it having character, then named a price that was cheap enough to gamble on. I bought it without thinking twice. I was visiting a small historic town that day. I had driven out early in the morning, hoping to see some old architecture and maybe grab a bite at a local diner. I never expected to leave with a strange camera, but once I had it, I felt this strange attachment. I wiped the dust off with the sleeve of my jacket. The brand name was barely visible, but it looked like a 35mm rangefinder from decades ago. The film compartment creaked when I opened it, and there was a faint smell of old leather and musty metal inside. I figured I'd test it out when I got home. That evening, I bought a few rolls of film from a small photography store not far from my apartment. I remember the cashier asking if I was into vintage cameras, and I told him I was just messing around. He warned me that older cameras can have all sorts of issues: light leaks, broken shutters, you name it. I nodded, but I wasn't too worried. I felt drawn to this camera for reasons I couldn't explain. I loaded the first roll of film later that night. The camera felt stiff. The focus ring got stuck sometimes, but it still seemed functional enough to take pictures. I snapped a few shots around my living room. I took photos of the couch, the TV stand, and the messy kitchen counter. The shutter sounded heavier than modern cameras, like a dull click that echoed inside the metal body. It gave me a weird sense of nostalgia, even though I never shot film as a kid. The next day, I walked around my neighborhood to use up the rest of the roll. I took pictures of random buildings, parked cars, and a few alleyways that had interesting graffiti. Nobody paid attention to me. I felt comfortable shooting in film. I liked not seeing the results right away. It felt more deliberate. After I finished the roll, I took it to a local lab. They said they'd have it ready in a couple of days. When I picked up the developed photos, I flipped through them in my car. Most shots were pretty standard. Grainy images of my furniture, the street outside my place, some random shops. But in each photo, I noticed a faint shadow in the corner. It was almost like a smudge. I thought maybe the camera had a light leak or some defect. At first, I didn't think much of it, but as I looked more closely, it started to look like a human silhouette. It was barely visible, but it seemed too defined to be a random smudge. My stomach tightened. I tossed the photos on the passenger seat and drove home. At home, I spread the prints on my kitchen table. I looked at them under the overhead light. In some, the shadow was just a faint blur. In others, it had a more distinct outline, like shoulders or the shape of a body. I shook my head, telling myself it had to be some weird camera flaw. But a little voice in the back of my mind kept saying, this wasn't normal. I felt a chill in my arms, and I decided to ignore it for the time being. I shot another roll of film the next day. I went to a nearby park, hoping to test the camera in better lighting conditions. I tried different angles, played with the focus, even adjusted the shutter speed. I wanted to see if the camera's defect would show up again. When I got the second roll developed, my hands felt shaky flipping through the prints. Sure enough, the shadow was there in every shot, usually in the bottom corner or off to the right side, and it was clearer. This time I could see what looked like a hood. It made my skin crawl. I studied the pictures one by one. The figure was always far enough to be overlooked at first glance, but once I noticed it, it was impossible to ignore. I felt a heavy knot in my stomach. I told myself it was just a trick of the light or an internal reflection. But it looked too much like a real person. I decided to see if it was a problem with the lens, so I took the camera to a repair shop. The guy there examined it. He said the lens had some scratches, the shutter was worn, but there was no obvious reason for a recurring shape in every photo. He suggested I try a different roll or maybe a different brand of film. So I bought some more film from him and walked out. That evening, I tried something else. I taped up the camera's edges with black electrical tape. thinking maybe there was a light leak somewhere. I loaded the new roll and stayed in my apartment, snapping random pictures of the hallway, the bathroom mirror, the closet, the laundry pile. I tried angles with no direct light source. I tried flash photography. I tried everything I could think of. After I finished, I had the roll developed at a nearby 24-hour lab. When the prints came out, my heart sank. The shadow was there in every picture. It seemed a bit closer, and the shape of the hood was more defined. My throat felt tight. I sat in my car for a while with the prints in my lap, my palms sweating. I didn't know what to do. Over the next week, I noticed I was feeling on edge. At first, I thought it was just stress from work, but I started feeling a presence behind me everywhere I went. It was subtle, like a tiny pressure on my shoulders. Sometimes I felt a faint brush of cold air near my neck. Other times, I thought I heard quiet footsteps behind me when I walked down the hallway of my apartment building. Every time I turned around, there was nobody there, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I tried ignoring it, but it got worse after I developed another set of photos. I had gone downtown for a work errand, and I brought the camera along, snapping pictures of the tall buildings and busy streets. When I got the prints back, the hooded figure was in each shot, still in the corner, but with more visible features. I could see the outline of a face under the hood, but it was shadowy. My heart thumped in my chest. My hands felt clammy. It seemed insane to keep using this camera, but I had this compulsive urge to figure out what was happening. I couldn't just toss it away. Every day I got more uneasy. One night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of what I thought was my door creaking. My eyes flew open. My heart pounded so loud I could hear it. I stayed still in bed, listening. The apartment was quiet, but I felt a cold draft, like something was moving in the hallway. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, got out of bed, and checked each room. Nothing was out of place, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was watching me. I hardly slept for the rest of the night. The next morning, I decided to confront this in a practical way. I told myself I'd do one final test. I would put the camera in a place I never go, set it up on a timer, and see if the shadow appeared. I found an empty storage room in the basement of my apartment building. It was dark, and the overhead light flickered. I placed the camera on an old table, set the self-timer, and left the room. I heard the shutter click from outside. After waiting a moment, I went back in, removed the film, and took it to get developed right away. When I picked up the pictures, my stomach twisted. The hooded figure stood in the middle of the frame, staring straight at the camera. I couldn't see eyes, but I felt them. It looked tall. The edges of the hood were frayed like old fabric. My hands trembled. This wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't dust in the lens. I felt a surge of panic flood through me. I rushed home, locked my door, and sat on the couch, flipping through the pictures again and again. My heart wouldn't stop racing. From that point on, my entire apartment felt suffocating. I heard faint knocks on the walls at random times. My lights flickered once or twice, though I couldn't be sure if it was just faulty wiring. I kept checking over my shoulder every few minutes. My chest felt tight, and I realized I was barely eating. Every time I heard a noise, I jumped. I stayed up late, not wanting to go to sleep. I even stopped bringing the camera outside. I stuck it in a box, shoved it in my closet, and told myself I was done with it. But the presence didn't fade. One morning I was brushing my teeth, and I saw a shape move behind me in the bathroom mirror. I spun around, toothpaste dribbling from my mouth, but the bathroom was empty. My reflection looked pale and scared. I could see the sweat on my forehead, even though it wasn't hot. My hands shook. I rinsed my mouth, turned off the light, and hurried out. A wave of dread filled my stomach. It was a gnawing feeling that something was in the apartment with me. I tried to distract myself by focusing on work. I took my laptop into the living room and sat on the couch. My job involves spreadsheets and emails, so it's usually enough to keep me occupied. But my mind kept drifting to the camera and the photos. I kept seeing the hooded figure in my head. I even tried to watch random videos online to calm down, but my nerves were shot. Every little sound made me jump. The sound of the refrigerator kicking on caused me to clench my jaw. My phone buzzing made me almost drop it. That evening, I decided to do something drastic. I walked into my bedroom, grabbed the box with the camera inside, and stuffed it in a plastic grocery bag. Then I took it down to my car. I started driving, not sure where to go. Eventually, I found a big dumpster behind a strip mall. I parked next to it, got out, and tossed the bag in with the rest of the trash. My hands were shaking the whole time. I felt a rush of relief, but it was mixed with fear. I had no idea if this would actually help, but I didn't know what else to do. For a moment, I stood there by my car, listening to the sounds of distant traffic. The night air was cool, and there was a faint smell of garbage in the air. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, trying to calm down. Then I got back in the car and drove home, trying not to look in the rearview mirror too much. I kept imagining the hooded figure sitting in the back seat. When I got home, I checked every room. I listened carefully. Nothing seemed out of place. I felt a bit lighter. I ordered some takeout and ate in silence, barely tasting the food. My appetite was weak, but I forced myself to eat. Then I fell onto the couch and flipped through channels on the TV until I dozed off around midnight. The next day I woke up and realized I hadn't heard any strange noises during the night. I took that as a good sign. I even left my apartment to get coffee. For a moment I felt normal, but while I was waiting in line, I got this uncomfortable feeling, like someone was standing too close behind me. I turned around and saw nobody there. My heart rate spiked anyway, and my shirt felt damp against my back. I shook my head, trying to shrug it off, and got my coffee. The rest of the day felt tense. Even though the camera was gone, the sense of being watched hadn't completely left. I kept telling myself it was all in my head, that maybe the camera was defective and I had psyched myself out. But deep down, I knew something else was happening. Around lunchtime, I heard what sounded like a faint knock on my front door. I stepped over quietly, looked through the peephole, and saw nothing. My hands felt clammy again. I told myself to calm down and went back to the kitchen, trying to make a sandwich. That afternoon, I tried to occupy myself with cleaning. I vacuumed, wiped down counters, and organized drawers, hoping to keep busy. The tension lingered in the back of my mind. When evening came, I tried watching a movie. Halfway through, I realized I felt that presence again, like a weight on the back of the couch. My neck prickled, and I paused the movie to look around. The living room was dim, lit only by the TV screen. My heart thumped. I sat there in silence, listening. No footsteps, no tapping, just my own breathing. But I couldn't shake that cold sensation on my arms. I decided to turn in early. I brushed my teeth, turned off the lights, and crawled into bed. My chest felt tight, and I stared at the ceiling, replaying the events of the last few weeks in my mind. I wondered if the figure had attached itself to me somehow. Even without the camera, maybe it was here. My muscles tensed up, and I had trouble sleeping. Every time I started to drift, I'd jerk awake. Sure, I heard something. Eventually, sheer exhaustion overtook me. It's been a few days now. I haven't developed any new film, obviously, and I haven't seen the camera. But I still feel a presence. Sometimes I catch movement in the corner of my eye. Other times I hear a soft shuffle in my apartment. I keep telling myself it'll fade. I keep telling myself this whole thing was some weird illusion caused by an old messed up camera. But every so often I feel like someone is standing right behind me, even if I'm just walking to the mailbox. I wish I had a better explanation for any of this. I don't know what that hooded figure is or why it showed up in my pictures. I don't know if I'm dealing with something supernatural or if my mind is playing tricks on me. All I know is that my hands still shake when I think about those photos. And even though I threw the camera away, I can't escape the uneasy sensation that the figure followed me. I'm just trying to get through each day without letting the fear consume me. I keep hoping it'll leave me alone, that maybe by discarding the camera, I severed some kind of link. But every time I sense that cold presence, I worry it might be trying to reach out from wherever it came from. And if that's true, I have no idea how to stop it. I never expected a simple visit to a coworker's farm to mess with my head. I showed up on a Thursday afternoon looking for a quiet place to unwind and get some space from city noise. My coworker Richard said his family's farm was mostly empty this time of year. He invited me to stay as long as I wanted. I thought it would be peaceful. I was wrong. I'm going to explain exactly what happened, step by step, without dressing it up. When I arrived, it was late in the day. The sun was going down, and I saw a few cows in the distance. They were in a fenced pasture behind an old barn. The barn had flaking red paint and a sagging roof. The field stretched out on either side of a gravel path that led to the main house. The main house was a single-story building with a wraparound porch. It looked worn but cozy. I parked near the porch, grabbed my bags from the trunk, and knocked on the door. Richard stepped out, greeted me, and told me I'd have the guest room on the left side of the hallway. He handed me an old key for the back door, saying I could come and go as I pleased. I remember feeling a slight tension in the air, but I figured it was just me being tired. After a quick dinner, I asked Richard if I could explore a bit before it got too dark. He shrugged and said, "Just watch your step. There's a stone well by the old paddock. We haven't used it in years." Then he said something about it being covered, but I don't think he was sure it still had a proper cover. I walked outside with a flashlight in my hand, moving carefully over uneven ground. The place smelled like damp earth and hay. The breeze was light, but the windmill behind the barn squeaked every few seconds. I kept walking until I saw a circular shape made of weathered stones near a section of broken fence. Grass grew around it, and there was a flimsy piece of wood across the top. It didn't cover the opening completely. A section of the wood had snapped. I took a closer look. The well stones were old and dark, crusted with moss in some areas. The opening was wide enough for a grown man to fit through. I felt a chill run through me, but I tried to ignore it. I found a small rock near my foot, picked it up, and tossed it in. I expected to hear it hit water or something solid. Instead, I heard a low muttering sound that echoed up to me. It didn't sound like splashing or a normal echo. It sounded like multiple voices buried under the earth. My stomach clenched. I thought maybe I was imagining it. I shined my flashlight down the well, but I couldn't see the bottom. It was just black. The stone walls reflected the beam for a short distance, but then it disappeared into darkness. I tried to listen more carefully. I couldn't pick out words, but the tone reminded me of muffled chanting. It made my head spin for a moment, and I leaned away from the well. I remember muttering something like, "What the hell was that?" Then I called out, "Hello?" My voice echoed back a bit, but I still heard that deeper sound underneath like a background noise. I stood there, uncertain. I looked around, but I didn't see anyone else on the property. The cows had moved farther away, and there was no sign of Richard. I told myself the sound was probably the wind hitting some pipes or an old drain at the bottom. I decided to head back to the house. Inside, I didn't mention the weird noise to Richard. I felt a little silly. We made small talk, and then he went to bed early. I stayed up in the living room reading a magazine under a dim lamp. The night was quiet except for the occasional squeak of the windmill and a few crickets outside. Around midnight, I got up and headed to the guest room. I remember tossing and turning, feeling restless. My mind kept replaying that strange murmur. Eventually, I drifted off for a couple of hours, but then a distant sound pulled me out of my sleep. It was a deep rumbling, almost like the engine of a large truck, but it wasn't coming from outside on the road. It felt like it was coming through the ground. I blinked, sat up, and strained my ears. The noise faded. I felt a heavy sensation in my chest, like I was on alert for something. I couldn't fall back asleep. In the morning, Richard left early to check on his other property in a nearby town. He told me to make myself at home, so I had the whole place to myself. I spent the afternoon walking around the fields, checking out the barn, feeding the cows from behind the fence. I kept glancing at the well, but I didn't go near it. By late afternoon, the sun was getting weaker, and I felt a sense of unease coming on. My body felt tense, and I kept rubbing my arms to shake off the feeling. I made a quick sandwich in the kitchen and ate it by the window. I could see the well from that spot. It looked like it was waiting for me to come closer. I tried to ignore it, By nightfall, I was alone in the main house with the lights on. The guest room door was open, and I could see my bed from the hall. I tried to watch some TV in the living room, but the screen flickered with static sometimes. The place felt too quiet for comfort. Around 9 p.m., I heard a shuffling noise outside. I turned off the TV and listened. It sounded like footsteps around the side of the house. I went to the front door and flipped on the porch light. Nothing. No movement. I walked over to the window in the kitchen that faced the well. My heart jumped when I saw something dark moving near the stones. It was a shape, a tall shadow, but I couldn't make out features. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside onto the porch. The windmill squeaked and the night air felt colder than before. My flashlight beam cut across the yard. I saw the well. I saw the broken plank on top of it. I didn't see anyone or anything standing there. The yard was empty. I felt my pulse pounding in my ears. I wasn't sure if my eyes had played tricks on me. I waited a few minutes, then went back in and locked the door. I double-checked the back door too. I wasn't used to locking everything on a farm, but I felt exposed. Eventually, I tried to calm down and go to bed. Once again, I had trouble sleeping. A few hours later, I heard that low rumble again, coming up from the ground. Then I heard a faint murmur, like the one I heard at the well. My chest tightened and I felt a knot in my stomach. It was as if I could hear those indistinct voices in my head, even though my ears weren't picking up anything clearly. I lay in bed sweating, staring at the dark ceiling. Then a slow scraping sound traveled along the outside wall of the guest room. It stopped near the window. I wanted to get up and look, but I was afraid of what I might see. The next morning, I found muddy smears on the outer side of the guest room window. They were shaped like handprints, but they were too elongated. The shape was irregular, like someone had dragged their palms down the glass. My heart hammered when I realized there were no footprints around the window. The ground was a bit wet from dew, but it wasn't disturbed. It didn't make sense. I felt a strong urge to call Richard and tell him I was leaving. But I also felt stubborn. I didn't want to run away from something without a clear explanation. I told myself I would spend one more day there to see if I could figure out what was going on. I stayed away from the well during the day. I spent most of the time in the barn, looking through old boxes and equipment. I found an old spool of rope, rusted tools, and broken wooden boards. The barn smelled like mold and stale hay. In one corner, I found a crate filled with old nails. Everything seemed normal in the sense that it was just typical farm junk. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. A few times I turned around quickly, expecting to see someone. There was never anyone there. By late afternoon, I was tired and sweating. I decided to go back inside and take a shower. The water pressure was weak and the pipes rattled. After I got out, I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. My eyes looked bloodshot and my shoulders felt tense. I heard a thud outside, so I grabbed my jeans and t-shirt and went to check. The sun was still up, but clouds covered most of the sky. I didn't see anything near the house. Then I saw movement by the well again. I stepped onto the porch with my shoes half on and I walked toward the well. My heart was beating so hard that my chest felt tight. As I moved closer, I noticed a flicker of a shape moving around the side of the well, like it was circling it. I called out, "Who's there?" I got no answer. I decided to approach the well directly. When I reached it, I heard a low hum coming from inside. I leaned over the edge. The broken plank on top was pushed aside. The hum sounded like a deep moan. My palms were sweating as I held the flashlight with one hand. I pointed it down, but again I saw nothing but the stone walls descending into darkness. Then the noise got louder, as if it recognized my presence. I felt a wave of dizziness. I had to brace myself against the edge. The voice or voices from the well were still unclear. It was like hearing a conversation from another room, but I couldn't pick out words or distinct sentences. My head spun and I backed away, nearly stumbling on the uneven ground. I hurried back into the house and slammed the door. I locked it again, breathing hard. I went to the kitchen table and sat down, trying to make sense of it. My pulse wouldn't slow down. I kept thinking about that figure I saw. It was tall and shadow-like, and it seemed interested in the well. I noticed it mostly around dusk or after dark. I felt certain that something was drawing these shadows to the well. Maybe they were coming from the well itself. I didn't know how to prove that, and I didn't want to investigate it alone at night. I decided I would stay awake and keep watch. I made a pot of coffee, found a chair that I could place near the living room window, and waited. Around 11 p.m., I started feeling jittery from the coffee. The outside was dark, and the porch light barely lit up anything beyond the immediate front yard. The well was in shadow, even though I could make out its rough shape. Around midnight, I spotted movement. 3 or 4 dark forms moved around the well. They looked like silhouettes of people, but they didn't have clear outlines. Their limbs looked too long, or their bodies seemed to shift in the dim light. My throat went dry and my hands trembled. I moved closer to the window, trying to keep my breathing quiet. The forms circled the well for a few minutes. Then, one by one, they seemed to slip down into the opening as if they were made of some kind of mist. I heard a low rumble again, like a distant earthquake. My entire body felt cold. My thoughts were scattered, and all I could think about was leaving the farm. I spent the rest of the night awake, sitting in the chair, barely blinking. The shadowy figures didn't appear again, but the memory of them burned into my mind. I could still hear that deep voice or voices echoing in my head. It felt like a slow vibration in my skull, more than an actual sound. When the morning light finally crept in, I was exhausted. I didn't even bother to eat breakfast. I sent a text to Richard, telling him I had an emergency back home and needed to leave. He said he understood, and that he'd be back later in the week. I packed my bag in a rush. I tried not to look out the window at that well. I felt dizzy and nauseous, as if I'd been sick with the flu. My hands shook while I locked the front door. I walked to my car, threw my bag in the trunk, and slid into the driver's seat. Before I turned the key, I heard one more deep moan in the distance. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a dark shape standing at the edge of the property near the fence line. It looked like it was facing me. Then it faded out of sight. My stomach clenched, and my heart pounded in my ears. I turned the ignition and pulled away, gravel crunching under my tires. I drove off the farm as fast as I could without skidding into a ditch. For several nights after I left, I couldn't sleep. I'd close my eyes and see those shadows moving around the well. I could almost hear that low hum or murmur in the back of my mind. My dreams turned into short bursts of half-sleep where I'd jolt awake, covered in sweat. I tried to tell myself it was just my nerves or stress. But every night, I heard a faint echo. It sounded like the voices from the well calling to me. Sometimes I'd lie in bed and feel the mattress vibrate with that rumble, even though there was no logical reason for it. I've tried to push it out of my mind, but even now I can sense it sometimes, especially in total silence. It's like a strange presence that follows me wherever I go. I haven't told anyone else about it, except for you right now. I'm not sure what to do. Part of me wants to go back to that farm and close off the well for good. Another part of me wants to pretend it doesn't exist, hoping the memories will fade. I can still feel that momentary vertigo I felt when I leaned over the well's edge. I can still feel the cold sweat and hear that chanting. I don't know if it was actually chanting, but I can't describe it any other way. It was a collective murmur that hit me like a pressure wave. My gut twists when I think about it. I don't plan on returning to that place anytime soon. The thought of seeing those shadows again makes my heart pound. I wish I had a normal explanation, but I don't. All I have is what I saw, what I heard, and how it made me feel. That farm turned from a simple weekend getaway into something that changed the way I sleep at night. Now, even when I'm in my own room, with the windows locked and the curtains closed, I feel like I'm never truly alone. I keep thinking I'll see a long shadow pass by my door, or I'll hear that muttering voice in the stillness before dawn. It's always right there, on the edge of my hearing. That's the truth of it, plain and simple. I went to a farm to relax, and I left with a sense of dread that follows me wherever I go. Even now, as I'm saying this, I can feel it looming somewhere behind my thoughts, waiting for a quiet moment to slip back in. I noticed something unusual about my basement floor about a month ago. It started as a few dark stains near the stairs. At first, I thought it was just some water damage. My house is old, and the basement has always felt damp. The concrete floor has little cracks, and there's a constant smell of earth. I never liked going down there. But when I saw how the stains were spreading, I couldn't ignore them. They looked strange, like blurry shapes that changed from day to day. Each time I went back, the stains had grown. They seemed to move along the floor in irregular patches. It wasn't just water. It was darker than typical moisture, and it left odd outlines, almost like warped faces or bent fingers. I couldn't explain it, but it made me feel uneasy. I tried cleaning them one afternoon. I brought a bucket of soapy water, a stiff brush, and a few old rags. The moment I knelt down, the smell from the stains reminded me of wet stone. It was thick and unpleasant, worse than normal dampness. I scrubbed for about 15 minutes. The water turned gray and murky in the bucket. The stains lightened, and I felt a small bit of relief. I thought I had it under control. But that night, I woke up because I heard a dripping noise, as if something was leaking deep below the basement. It was faint, but it sounded too steady to be random. It echoed in my head and made it hard to sleep. In the morning, I checked the basement. The stains were back, darker than before, spread out in new patterns. Some looked like outlines of wide eyes. Others had shapes that resembled open mouths. I felt my throat tighten, and a wave of nausea hit me. I stood there with my foot on the bottom step, unsure if I should walk across the floor. I could see the stains creeping around, forming clusters of twisting shapes. My chest felt heavy, and my heart pounded against my ribs. There was an odd tension in the air, like the basement itself was waiting for something. I tried to ignore that feeling and stepped down. I turned on my flashlight to see if maybe there was a small leak somewhere. I shone it along the cracks in the walls. Everything was damp, but not enough to cause such dark patches. I didn't see any water seeping in from outside. The only thing I heard was the constant dripping below me. It sounded like it came from under the concrete, like water dropping into a metal bucket somewhere in the ground. I decided to try bleach. I poured bleach directly onto the largest stain. My eyes stung from the smell, and my throat burned. I scrubbed the spot until I felt my muscles ache. The stain began to fade, but as I watched, another mark, shaped like a crooked handprint, formed a few inches away. It spread across the concrete surface while I was still scrubbing. It was slow, almost imperceptible, but it inched along, smearing into a black outline. I stopped and stared. My jaw clenched. I remember muttering, "This can't be real." But it was there, plain as day. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the basement. I tried distracting myself by watching TV, but my mind kept drifting back to that drip sound. I imagined it echoing through the pipes, or maybe through some hidden cavern under the house. My legs felt restless. I got up, paced around, then sat back down. Eventually, I went to bed, but my sleep was restless. My dreams were filled with images of black shapes crawling over my floor. The next morning, I went downstairs again. The stains had doubled in size. They covered most of the area around the center of the basement. A few boxes I'd left on the floor had dark streaks along their edges. The cardboard was soaked, like the black substance had leached into the bottom. I opened one of the boxes to check what was inside. It had some old tools and rusted nails, all covered in a thin layer of that dark stain. It smelled rancid, like musty earth, and something else I couldn't name. My eyes watered. I decided to move everything off the floor. I dragged boxes to the far corner, stacked them on a wooden pallet, and put some plastic under them so the stains wouldn't spread to my stuff. The basement felt colder than usual, and my hands were shaking. I kept glancing at the floor to see if the shapes were shifting while I worked. I couldn't tell if I was imagining things. Every time I turned around, I had the sense that they had spread an inch. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. I felt sweat gather on my forehead. Later that day, I went to the hardware store. I asked the clerk about potential causes for weird stains on a basement floor. He gave me a puzzled look. He mentioned mold, mildew, maybe some seepage. I bought heavy-duty cleaning supplies, dehumidifiers, and sealants. I wanted to do a thorough job. I wanted to solve the problem. But a part of me knew this wasn't a normal moisture issue. I just couldn't say that out loud without sounding unhinged. When I got back, I spent hours treating the floor. I wore rubber gloves and a mask. I sprayed every suspicious spot with cleaner. I used a fan to circulate air. I set up a dehumidifier in the corner to try to dry everything out. I felt a small sense of accomplishment. By the time I was done, I couldn't see most of the stains. The black marks had faded to faint gray blotches. My clothes were damp with sweat. My arms hurt from all the scrubbing and lifting. I shut off the basement light and locked the door, hoping I'd wake up to a normal floor. That night I barely slept, but I tried to stay optimistic. In the morning, I opened the basement door. The smell of damp earth hit me immediately, like walking into a cave. I flipped on the light. The stains covered the entire center of the floor again. They had spread to the walls this time. I saw black streaks running vertically, as if something had clawed its way up. My stomach turned, and I felt a wave of dizziness. I stepped back and let the door close. I stood there in the hallway, breathing in and out, trying to calm myself. My mind raced. I pictured some hidden chamber under my house or old pipes carrying strange runoff. But those explanations didn't fit the shapes. They were too defined. They looked like twisted faces pressed into the concrete. They looked like they were stretching. I decided to shine a bright work light on the floor to see details more clearly. I plugged in the lamp and pointed it at the center of the room. I squatted down, keeping a few feet of distance between me and the largest stain. I could see raised edges like the concrete had warped in places. The rest of the surface was slightly uneven, and thin cracks formed outlines that resembled eyes and mouths. I reached out and tapped one of the areas with a metal scraper. The concrete surface felt soft, almost spongy. It gave under the pressure of the scraper, and a droplet of black liquid seeped up. I jerked back, nearly dropping the tool. My heart pounded. I wiped the tool on an old rag and watched as a small patch of the floor pulsed with a wet sheen, then went still. I couldn't stay down there alone for much longer. My back was tense, and every small noise made me flinch. The drip, drip, drip echoed from beneath me. It never stopped. I took the scraper and chipped at one of the cracks. A small chunk of concrete came loose, revealing a damp layer of earth beneath. The soil looked dark and smelled stale. I leaned closer and felt my stomach twist. Something about it felt off. It was dense and sticky, like clay mixed with something else. I pressed my finger into it. It felt cold, and it left a sticky residue on my glove. I pulled back and decided I needed more help. I called a local contractor and explained that I had foundation issues in my basement. I didn't mention the faces or the shapes. I just said the concrete was cracking and there was unusual moisture. They said they'd send someone in a few days. I hated waiting that long, but I had no choice. I tried to avoid the basement until then. Each night, though, I heard that dripping noise. Sometimes it sounded like soft tapping on metal. Other times it was more like a slow, steady drip. My mind conjured images of something below the house, moving around in the soil, pressing against the concrete. On the second night, I decided to check again. The smell was overpowering this time, like mildew mixed with rotting leaves. My eyes watered. I turned on the light and saw that the stains were now climbing up the support beams in thin streaks. They looked like veins. I touched one of the beams. It felt damp. The wood had started to swell a little. I ran my hand along the surface and felt lumps where the blackness had spread beneath the paint. I heard a faint creak from the ceiling above me, and I tensed up. It reminded me that the entire structure of the house might be affected if this kept going. My breath came in short bursts, and I could feel my pulse in my neck. I spent that night trying to do more research online. I searched for basement moisture issues, unusual mold, unexplained leaks. I found stories about old houses with hidden wells, about ancient pipes that caused weird stains, about fungus that grew in strange patterns. None of it matched what I was seeing. I couldn't find a single reference to black shapes that looked like faces. The more I read, the more anxious I got. My mouth felt dry. I drank water, but it didn't help. I had a growing sense that something wanted my attention. I kept seeing those outlines in my head, especially that bizarre hand-like shape near the stairs. When the contractor arrived, I showed him the cracks and the stains, but I didn't go into detail about the shapes. He examined the walls, tapped around with a small hammer, and said the foundation had some issues with water infiltration. He suggested digging around the outside of the house to seal it. He also mentioned that the floor might need to be broken up if there was a serious leak beneath. While he spoke, I kept noticing that the fresh black marks on the floor seemed to fade under the bright overhead light. It was as if they didn't want to be seen. I felt an odd relief, but also a jolt of frustration because I wanted him to see everything as it truly was. I nudged him to look at the center of the room, where I'd noticed the shapes moving. But by then, the shapes looked more like regular water stains. He left with a promise to send me a quote. I felt more alone than ever. I needed a plan. That night, I decided to set up a camera. I had an old camcorder with night vision. I set it on a tripod aimed at the center of the basement floor. I turned off all the lights and went upstairs. I felt uneasy, but I was determined to see if there was any movement overnight. I didn't sleep well. Every hour or so, I heard faint tapping or dripping. At one point, I thought I heard a low moan, but I convinced myself it was just the wind. The next morning, I retrieved the camera. I fast-forwarded through the footage until I spotted movement. Around 2:14 a.m., I saw the patches on the floor shimmer a little. It was faint, but I could see them darken in certain spots, then fade, then expand. It was like watching a slow, breathing motion across the surface of the concrete. At times, the shapes combined and formed a larger blotch. Then that blotch broke apart into smaller ones. My skin prickled as I watched. By 4 a.m., the shapes had grown enough to touch the wooden support beams. I saw them climb an inch or two. My stomach felt sour, and my fingers trembled. There was no question that something was happening down there. I decided to confront it. I brought the camera back down, set it to record, and stood in the center of the basement. The floor felt cool and damp beneath my shoes. My eyes darted around, looking for any sign of new stains forming. The dripping sound was steady, echoing up from below. My heart thudded so loud I could hear it in my ears. I spoke out loud, something along the lines of, "What do you want?" I felt foolish, but the question just erupted from me. The entire room felt thick with tension, like the walls were pressing in. My arms felt weak and my legs shook. There was no response except for the steady drip. I dragged a heavy metal rod across the floor, hoping maybe I'd hear a hollow spot. The sound was dull and muffled, but near the center, it turned sharper, like the concrete was thinner. I knelt down and pressed my ear to the floor. I heard the dripping louder. It echoed through the concrete. My breath hitched. My body tensed. It felt like something was right below me, waiting. I grabbed my metal scraper again and started chipping at the surface where I'd heard the change in sound. The top layer was firm, but once I got through a thin crust of concrete, I hit moist soil. It sank in around the scraper, letting out a thick, earthy smell. I kept going, pulling away bits of wet earth. After about 10 minutes, I stopped. I wasn't sure if I was opening a path for something to come up. I decided I'd covered enough ground to see something if there was an actual leak or a pipe. I pointed my flashlight into the small hole. All I saw was black dirt. I touched it with my gloved hand. It felt cold again, denser than normal soil. It almost seemed to vibrate under my hand. My breath caught and I yanked my hand back. I scrambled to my feet. My heart pounded and I felt a chill race up my spine. I stared down at that hole, half expecting something to emerge. For a few moments I just stood there, breathing hard. Nothing moved. The drip continued. I turned off my camera and walked upstairs, locking the basement door behind me. I haven't tried digging deeper. I'm not sure if I want to know what's under there. Each night I still hear that drip. Some nights it's louder, like it's moving up toward the floorboards. Other nights it fades away, leaving me in silence. The stains keep spreading no matter how much I clean. I've used strong chemicals. I've tried sealing cracks with cement. And I've even thought about calling the fire department to see if they can pump out any water. But I know this isn't normal water. I can feel something lingering beneath my house. I sense it in the way the air feels heavier every time I open the basement door. I see it in the new stains that appear where I just scrubbed the day before. My arms tense, and my palms sweat every time I step on that last stair. I can't sleep without imagining those shapes twisting across the floor. I can't think of any logical reason for it, but I don't need logic at this point. I just need it to stop. I'm still waiting for the contractor's final word on what to do next. I haven't told anyone else, it's too weird. I keep thinking about that hole I started to dig. It's not a large hole, maybe a few inches across, but it's enough to remind me of what lies just under the surface. I don't want to break the entire floor without professional help, but I'm scared of what might happen if I just leave it. Sometimes, I imagine the stains spreading through the walls and into the living spaces of the house. I picture them creeping up the stairs, inch by inch. That's when my chest tightens and my breathing gets shallow. For now, the problem stays in the basement. I lock the door, but I know that doesn't really keep it contained. I hear the dripping late at night. I feel the cold dampness in my home's foundation. Every time I take a breath in the living room, I smell a hint of that earth and bleach. I can't escape it. It's in the pipes, in the wood, in the air. It hasn't taken over the rest of the house yet, but I sense it's only a matter of time. I'm hoping the contractor can fix this soon. I'm hoping I can go back to ignoring the basement like I used to. But with each new black shape I see forming on the floor, my hope slips away. I'm left with the reality that something under my house is restless, and I have no idea how to stop it. I paused at the threshold and wondered if I should even step inside. The corridor smelled like damp wood and stale air. My flashlight cut through the darkness, showing rows of dusty posters. Each poster looked distorted by age, with corners curled and colors faded into gray patches. I took a deep breath. I was hired to restore this place. I had a job to do, even if every instinct told me I shouldn't linger too long. The old theater felt heavy, like it was holding on to memories I didn't want to discover. Still, I took my first steps and heard my boots echo. I couldn't see much, but the echo made the place feel massive and empty. I pushed forward, thinking I should locate the stage. That was my main goal on the first day. I'm a scenic designer. I deal with sets, backdrops, and every visual element that brings life to a performance. When I got the call about this theater, I was told it had been closed for years. The city wanted to bring it back to life. They were planning a grand reopening with a classic show. The budget was decent, and I jumped at the chance. I didn't expect anything too complicated. Old theaters are usually just dusty places that need fresh paint, new curtains, and a few structural fixes. I hadn't counted on the silence that felt like it was watching me. The corridor seemed endless, with broken light fixtures overhead. My flashlight beam flickered a bit, but I ignored it. I had fresh batteries in there. I found the door that led to the main seating area. It was stuck, probably swollen from moisture. I leaned my shoulder into it, gave it a hard shove, and felt it pop open. The door creaked like it was complaining. The sight inside made me pause. Rows of seats faced the stage. Most of the seats were covered in thick dust. Some seat cushions had holes or rips. A stale odor hovered in the air, something like old carpets and mold. I swallowed hard and moved slowly down the aisle. My flashlight swung across the stage. I saw torn backdrops that must have been left halfway through a production. A few set pieces leaned against the walls, their paint peeling. The big velvet curtains at the front looked stiff and faded. I walked up the steps onto the stage and nearly coughed from the layer of dust I kicked up. I set my tool bag down. The stage felt unsteady under my feet. Pieces of rotted wood splintered along the edges. I scanned the area for any sign of water damage or structural risk. The boards squeaked a little, but I thought they might hold for now. I aimed my flashlight toward the wings. Old costumes hung on racks. Some were stained, some torn, and all had that musty smell that I associate with abandoned closets. I walked over to look at them. Most had tags with names I didn't recognize. They were from some old production, maybe a period drama. As I stood there, I heard what sounded like a soft clap. It was just a single clap, like someone testing the acoustics. I jerked my flashlight around, but I saw no one. My heart thumped a bit. It was probably something falling or settling, I thought. I stepped back onto the main part of the stage and started planning. My job was to note the stage dimensions and see how much we needed to rebuild. I had a small notepad. I started measuring with a tape, marking down lengths. Everything was quiet. Then I heard applause. It wasn't loud, but it was definitely clapping. It sounded like a small audience giving polite applause for a dress rehearsal. My neck tightened and I spun around. The seats were empty. The clapping faded. My mouth went dry. I told myself I was just imagining it, or maybe there was some old speaker system shorting out. Still, I felt a pulse of adrenaline. I wanted to check the backstage area, so I walked toward the curtains. The velvet curtains were bigger up close than I'd expected. The fabric looked worn. I saw handprints in the dust, like someone had pressed their palms into the fabric. The shape of the hands was distinct, and they seemed new. No footprints on the floor around them, though. I touched one of the marks. The dust was smeared, revealing the red velvet underneath. I jerked my hand away. It was cold, almost damp. I felt a chill run along my arms. I rubbed them to warm up. I reminded myself that old buildings have drafts and weird humidity pockets. It was probably nothing. Still, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I pushed through the curtain and found the backstage area. The floor back there was cluttered with empty crates, old paint cans, and broken props. I noticed a disconnected door labeled Green Room on the far side. The corridor next to it led to the dressing rooms. I needed to know how much of the backstage structure was salvageable, so I went over to the dressing rooms. The first one had a large mirror with yellowed lights around the edges. The surface of the mirror was hazy, like the glass had rotted from inside. I stared at my reflection. My eyes looked tired, and I had a faint layer of dust on my jacket. Then I saw another face behind mine, just for a split second, like an outline. I whipped around, and the room was empty. My stomach clenched. I could feel sweat beading on my forehead. I left that dressing room and tried to open the next. The door opened with a squeak. This dressing room was a little bigger, with 2 mirrors side by side. Both were just as cloudy. There were stools in front of them, and a broken makeup kit on the counter. As I scanned the room, I heard voices in the hall. They sounded faint, like people in casual conversation. I stepped out of the room and looked left, then right. No one was there. The corridor was dark. My flashlight beam caught only peeling paint and old posters on the walls. Still, I heard those voices. They were low and calm, like actors running lines. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was rehearsed like a script. I clenched my fists and forced myself to keep going. I had to see all the dressing rooms anyway. That was part of my job. The next few rooms looked similar. Mirrors, chairs, random bits of costumes. In one room, I found a single shoe on the floor. It looked like a character shoe for dancing with a leather sole. It was covered in dust, but the strap was unbuckled. I picked it up and set it on the counter, feeling uneasy. This place felt like it was stuck in time, waiting for someone to finish something. I just wanted to finish my survey and leave for the day. I checked my watch. It was only mid-afternoon, but the windows in the backstage corridor were covered with thick drapes, so it felt like late evening. I wanted better light, so I opened one of the drapes. A bit of sunlight came through, illuminating tiny particles of dust. I could see them dancing in the air. Then I heard footsteps behind me. They were slow and deliberate, like someone walking in heavy boots. I turned, shining my flashlight. Nothing. The corridor was still empty. My breathing got shallow. My mind raced. I wondered if maybe another worker was here without me knowing. But I remembered the caretaker said I'd be the only one here today. I walked back to the stage to gather my things. I wanted to call the caretaker just to confirm that no one else was around. As I approached my tool bag, I heard the sound of chairs folding up, like audience seats flipping. I looked out at the auditorium. Nothing moved, but the sound continued, as if seat after seat was returning to an upright position. Then it stopped. I felt my throat tighten. My palms were sweaty. I pulled out my phone. No signal. The caretaker had mentioned the walls were thick, and phone reception might be spotty. I swore under my breath and stuffed the phone back into my jacket pocket. I decided to take a quick look around the stage one more time before leaving. The structure under the stage might be important for my next steps. There was a narrow staircase that led beneath it. I descended carefully, the wood creaking under my weight. The air down there was even more stale, with a slight odor of something like old metal or rust. My flashlight lit up old cables, wooden supports, and a few abandoned set pieces. I heard a faint humming sound, like distant chanting or a group vocal warm-up. It echoed around me. I couldn't pinpoint the source. My heart thumped harder and I felt a knot in my stomach. I walked through the understage area, ducking under beams. My footsteps were slow. Each step felt like a risk. I found a broken stool and a few random props, a fake tree trunk, a large plastic column, and a cardboard backdrop piece with a castle painted on it. Dust clung to every surface. The humming grew louder for a moment, then cut out. I stopped, held my breath, and waited for something else. Silence again. That silence felt alive, like it was waiting for my next move. I felt a bead of sweat roll down my temple. I turned around and headed back to the staircase. On my way out, I noticed a small door marked storage. It was unlocked. I pushed it open. Inside, there were large shelves piled with old costumes, random props, and some bits of scenery. The smell of mothballs hit me immediately. I stepped inside and poked around with my flashlight. I saw dusty hats, torn curtains, leftover fabric rolls. Then I noticed a faint handprint on one of the shelves. It looked recent, with a thin layer of dust around it. The size of the hand was similar to mine, maybe a bit smaller. I wiped sweat from my brow and backed out of the storage room. I locked the door behind me, even though I had no key. I just slid the bolt on the inside and pulled the door shut. It didn't make sense, but I did it anyway because something felt wrong in there. I climbed the stairs and walked straight to my tool bag. My flashlight flickered again. I planned to head home for the day. I needed to regroup, charge my phone, and maybe bring more light tomorrow. As I grabbed my bag, I heard a new sound behind me. It was the rustle of fabric. I turned and saw the velvet curtains sway, like someone had brushed against them. My heart pounded. I shined the flashlight on the spot where they moved. I could see the dust swirling in the beam, but no figure, no shape. The curtain settled. I picked up my pace and made my way down the aisle. When I reached the exit, I heard a single applause again, one sharp clap. I didn't look back. I stepped into the corridor, pulled the door shut, and hurried toward the front entrance. The corridor felt narrower now. I could swear the lights overhead flickered, even though they were off. The caretaker had told me there was no power yet, so it had to be my imagination. My breathing was fast. My hands shook. I just needed to get out. I reached the main doors. They were heavy and required a hard push. They made a scraping noise as they swung open. Cool air hit my face and I let out a long breath. Outside it was late afternoon, and the sunlight felt comforting. I stood on the worn steps and glanced back at the entrance. I half expected someone to follow me out. Nothing moved. I closed the doors behind me and walked to my truck. My legs felt shaky, and my shirt was damp under my arms. I got in, locked the doors, and just sat there for a minute. The building loomed in front of me, old and silent from the outside. I started the engine, telling myself I'd come back tomorrow with better equipment and maybe a coworker. That night, I barely slept. My mind kept replaying the applause, the strange footprints, the handprints on the curtains. I tried to rationalize it. Old buildings make noise. Dust in the air can create illusions in the flashlight beam. Maybe some squatter was inside, messing around, but it didn't feel like that. The next day I arrived early, right after sunrise, hoping to catch some daylight in the main seating area. I brought extra flashlights and a portable work lamp. The caretaker wasn't there, which was normal for that hour. I entered through the same door, noticing how the smell of dust greeted me again. Inside, I set up the work lamp on the stage. The bright light cut across the old wood, creating sharp shadows. I walked around, checking for footprints. There were none. The silence was thick, just like before. I tested the seats, pulling a few down and letting them flip back. I thought maybe that was the source of the folding seat sounds from yesterday. As I tested them, I realized they didn't sound the same as what I heard. The actual noise yesterday was more gradual, like a row of seats flipping in sequence. My test only produced single snaps. I tried not to let the unease get to me. I had tasks to do. I needed to measure the proscenium arch and see if the rigging for the curtains could be salvaged. I climbed a small ladder near the wings and examined the pulley systems. The ropes were frayed. I wrote down notes about replacements. My mind wandered back to the applause. I kept checking over my shoulder, expecting to see a shadow or movement, but it was quiet. I spent most of the morning repairing a portion of the stage floor. I replaced a few rotted boards and hammered them into place. The sound of my hammer echoed. At one point, I thought I heard a voice calling from the auditorium, but when I set down the hammer and listened, I heard nothing. I rolled my stiff shoulders and tried to ignore the creeping tension. After a short lunch break outside, I came back in and decided to check the dressing rooms again. I wanted to see them in daylight. The corridor was gloomy, but I could see dust motes floating in the sunlight that crept through small windows. I entered the first dressing room. The mirror was still foggy. I glanced at it quickly, but all I saw was my own reflection. In the second dressing room, I noticed that the single shoe I'd placed on the counter was on the floor again, as if someone had moved it. I stared at it, my heart pounding. I reached down and picked it up. It felt cold to the touch, like it had been in a freezer. My hand shook a little as I set it back on the counter. Then I felt goosebumps on my arms. The temperature in the room dropped. My breath felt tight. I turned and left. Out in the corridor, the voices started again. This time they were more distinct, like lines from a play. I heard someone say, "We need to start from the top," in a firm tone. I heard a response that sounded like, "All right, places, please." My stomach flipped. It sounded so close, like people standing right there. But no one was visible. I broke into a cold sweat. I took a step forward, then another. The voices stopped. My ears rang in the silence. I hurried to the stage, grabbed my things, and headed out once more. I glanced at the velvet curtains on my way. I swear I saw them move again, just a slight sway. When I finally exited, the caretaker was outside, checking something in the small courtyard. I told him I needed more help for the restoration. He looked at me with a concerned expression and nodded. I didn't explain what had happened. I just said the theater had issues I wasn't prepared to handle alone. He said he understood. We agreed to bring in a small crew next time. He locked the doors and we both left. I've gone back a few times with the crew. Nobody has experienced anything quite like I did, at least not to the same degree. But sometimes the workers mention weird sounds or flickering lights. They tell me they hear the occasional footstep or see something move in the corner of their eye. Still, the work continues. We're making progress on the sets, the new paint, the seating repairs. The city wants this place reopened in a few months. Every day I feel uneasy in there. It's like the theater itself is waiting for something. The caretaker asked if we wanted to bring in a security guard at night. I refused. I don't want anyone alone in there until we finish. I'm not giving up. I was hired to finish this job, and I will. But I can't ignore what I've seen and heard. The old costumes, the dusty curtains, the half-finished sets. Everything feels like it's reaching out to me. I try to stay focused on practical tasks. I try to remind myself that walls creak and old floors settle. But I still hear applause sometimes, and I still catch glimpses of shapes in mirrors that aren't mine. The caretaker says I look worn down. He's right, I barely sleep. I keep expecting the day when something undeniable happens in front of the whole crew. Until then, I'll keep working. I'm moving forward with the design plans, ordering materials, and coordinating with the city's representatives. The theater is coming back to life. Part of me senses it's not just about a new show for living patrons. Something else wants a final performance. I stand here every morning and feel it in the silence. I still get chills when I walk past those velvet curtains. Sometimes I see those fresh handprints, and I place my own hands against them, just to see if they match. They never do. They always vanish the next day and then reappear in a different spot. But I'm here to do my job. I'll do it until the place is ready for the lights to come up and the audience to file in. I just hope that whatever's been watching me is satisfied when the curtain finally opens. I woke up on my third day here with a bad feeling in my stomach. I glanced outside and saw those footprints for the first time. They were bigger than my own footprints, but not by much. The shape reminded me of someone walking barefoot on damp ground, except the heels dragged out a bit, leaving these flattened trails behind them. It looked clumsy. At first I thought maybe someone was messing around, or maybe it was some weird animal I hadn't seen before. But the prints had 5 distinct toes and a rough outline that seemed too close to a person's foot. That was enough to make my chest tighten. I stared at them for a while, trying to figure out how they got so close to my front door without waking me. Then I went back inside and locked every window. I picked this chalet for peace and quiet. I planned on fishing in the lake nearby, writing a few notes in my journal, and just taking it easy. But after I found those footprints, I felt a weight in my chest every time the sun started to go down. There's no phone signal out here, and the nearest neighbor is a good hour's drive away down a twisty road. The air is cold and thin, and there's not much cover out here except for a few trees around the slope. Once night comes, it's pitch black. My flashlight only stretches a short distance. That first evening after seeing the footprints, I kept my lantern on in the living room. I made sure the doors and windows were locked. I tried to sleep, but my heart was pounding. The next morning, I checked the perimeter. There were more footprints, circling the house. It was like something had walked around the entire chalet, pausing near the windows. I saw prints in the muddy patches by the back door. I spotted partial prints near a side window. There was a faint smell in the air, something stale and sour, but I couldn't tell if it was just old leaves. I stood there for a while, feeling a sense of dread crawl up my spine. My hands felt clammy. I went back inside and decided I would keep watch that night. I made coffee after dinner. I turned off the lights in the living room, cracked the window slightly so I could hear outside, and sat down with a blanket over my legs. I had a small flashlight and my phone next to me, even though the phone was useless out here. Around midnight, I started feeling a tingle in my limbs from the cold. The chalet's heater works, but I didn't want to turn it on because of the noise. I wanted to hear everything outside. By 1 a.m., I had dozed off a couple of times, jerking awake whenever my head dropped. At around 3 a.m., the buzzing started. It wasn't loud, but it was steady. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It was like a faint hum, almost like wires overhead, but not quite. It filled the air in a way that I felt inside my ears and down my neck. It made my skin prickle. I stayed still, listening. Then I saw them. There were shapes in the darkness. The moonlight was weak that night, so I only caught glimpses of movement. They were outside, spaced out around the perimeter of the chalet. I counted 3 at first, then maybe 4. They moved slowly, stepping with a slouch or shuffle. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I inched closer to the window, careful not to make a sound. And that's when one of them stepped into a patch of moonlight near the wood pile. It was tall. The legs were a bit uneven, and the arms hung too low. The head was slightly tilted forward. I couldn't see the face, just a blurred shape where the features should have been. I felt a jolt in my gut. My breath caught in my chest. The buzzing grew louder, and I realized it was coming from them, or at least it seemed like it was. It wasn't any language I recognized. It felt like it carried some sort of message. I couldn't interpret it, but it made my nerves light up like I was in danger. I clutched my flashlight, fighting the urge to flick it on. but I knew that might draw their attention. They circled the house for a while, stepping in that dragged way. A couple of them paused at the windows. I heard gentle tapping on the glass at one point, and I thought my heart might burst. I just stayed low and tried to make myself smaller. My legs started to cramp, and I realized I was gripping the windowsill so hard my knuckles hurt. There was a moment when I thought one of them saw me. Its head turned slowly toward the exact spot where I crouched. The buzzing seemed to swell for a second, like they were communicating about me. I held my breath, but it didn't break the glass. It moved on. After about half an hour of them drifting around, the buzzing started to fade. The figures disappeared into the darkness. I waited another hour before I dared to stand up. By the time dawn arrived, I felt exhausted. My eyes were gritty, my neck was stiff, and my stomach felt sour. Outside, the footprints were there again, many of them overlapping. They formed these messy trails in the mud. There were smears near the windows, like hands or arms dragging across the surface. I took a deep breath and tried to think logically. I needed a plan. I needed to secure the place. I grabbed every piece of furniture I could move and started placing them against doors and windows, especially the back door. It was heavy labor. I shoved a small dresser in front of the entrance, plus a chair jammed under the doorknob. I closed all the curtains, even though part of me wanted to see outside. The isolation felt worse this way, but I couldn't stand the idea of them looking in. Throughout the day, I forced myself to eat something. My appetite was gone, but I needed the energy. My hands trembled when I tried to hold a fork. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting something to burst in. The hours until nightfall felt long and short at the same time. I tried reading an old magazine I found in a drawer, but I couldn't concentrate on the words. My thoughts kept drifting to the images of those figures. I felt certain they were coming back. I wasn't sure what I would do if they actually tried to break in. I had a knife from the kitchen, but that didn't make me feel safe. My pulse kept racing every time I imagined the door handle turning from the outside. Night came. I turned off all the lights, blocked the windows as best I could, and sat in the corner of the living room. The heater was off, and the silence made every little noise stand out. My breathing seemed too loud. I tried to distract myself by counting my breaths. That only made me more aware of how tight my chest felt. By 2 a.m. I was sweating even though the air was cold. Every minute dragged. I jumped at every creak of the old chalet, at every rustle of wind outside. Then the buzzing returned, low and steady. At first it just hummed around the cabin like a breeze, but I knew better. I crawled to the window and peeked through a gap in the curtain. They were there again. I could see a few shapes this time, maybe 4 or 5. My mouth went dry. The way they moved made my skin crawl, like their joints didn't bend the right way. One was closer to the front door, reaching out with a hand. The hand looked thin, with knobby knuckles. It tapped lightly on the wood, then slid up to the door handle. I heard the handle rattle. I pressed my back against the wall, feeling my heart race. I gripped my flashlight, thinking about shining it, but I froze. My thoughts were mostly curses and raw panic. I held my breath, hoping they would move on. They didn't. One of them started tapping on the window nearest the kitchen. Another stood in front of the living room window, just inches from the glass. The buzzing sound seemed to shift in tone, like they were conferring with each other. I reached for my phone out of instinct. No signal. I felt a wave of helplessness surge through me. My pulse hammered in my ears so hard it was almost painful. I imagined them prying open the door or smashing the window. I tried to think if I had time to hide. But hide where? The chalet is small. My mind was racing with scenarios, none of them good. The tapping got louder. They were definitely testing the barriers. I could hear a sort of scraping, as if one of them was dragging its nails or maybe a tool across the wood. I inched over to the small hallway that leads to the bedroom and bathroom. I shut the bedroom door behind me, though that made me feel a bit trapped. I stood there for a long time, just listening. My breath was shallow, and my knees felt weak. The buzzing outside rose and fell in waves. Sometimes it sounded closer, sometimes further. I got the sense they were moving around the house, examining every corner. At one point, I heard a rattling noise by the back door, like they were pushing on it. The dresser I put against it made a scraping sound as it shifted on the floor. I was sure they'd break it open right then, but it held. Sometime around 4 a.m., the noise started to diminish. I heard a low hum that slowly grew softer. The tapping stopped. I waited another 30 minutes before building up the courage to peek out. When I moved back into the living room, I felt my legs wobble. My shirt was damp with sweat. I looked through a corner of the curtain. They were gone. The porch was empty. The footprints near the door looked deeper and more smeared, but there was no sign of them. The sky had that faint light that comes just before dawn. I realized my jaw hurt because I'd been clenching it so hard. I didn't sleep that morning. My thoughts were scattered and my body felt weak. I figured I had to do something more to protect the chalet. I started piling more furniture in front of the windows, especially the ones where I'd heard the tapping. I found some old nails and a hammer in a closet. I tried to secure some boards across the largest window in the living room. My hands kept shaking and I almost hit my thumb a couple of times. I had to stop for a moment because my heart was pounding and I felt dizzy. I drank some water and forced down a piece of bread. The day was quiet. I didn't see any movement outside. It was unsettling, though. The silence felt heavier than normal. No birds chirped, and even the wind seemed to stop. The only noise was my own breathing and the occasional creak of the floor as I moved around. I managed to barricade the main windows pretty well. I pushed a heavy armoire against the living room window from the inside, leaving just a small gap where I could peek out if I needed to. By late afternoon, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. The sun started sinking behind the mountains, and that familiar tightness in my chest came back. Night fell again, and I waited in the living room behind the barricaded furniture. I kept the lights off. I sat on the floor with the knife in my hand and the flashlight nearby. My back rested against the couch. Every time I blinked, I felt a jolt of worry that I might miss the first sign of movement. I couldn't relax. My shoulders ached from holding myself tense. The darkness pressed in from outside. Around 2:30 a.m., the buzzing started again. My pulse skyrocketed. I swallowed hard and forced myself to stay calm, or at least not to panic completely. They approached from different angles. I could hear faint steps on the porch, and I saw shadows move across the gap in the curtains. One of them moved close to the boarded window. I heard wood creaking under some pressure, as if it was testing my makeshift barricade. A second figure paced near the back door. The handle jiggled. My throat felt tight and sweat dripped down my temples. I clutched the knife so hard my hand hurt. The buzzing rose and fell. I wondered if they were talking about me, about how to get inside, or if they even understood what doors and windows were. The not knowing filled my chest with a deep fear that made me feel almost sick. Then the doorknob turned partway. The chair jammed against it from the inside, held for now. But the handle kept twisting. I saw it move up and down in short little jerks. My heart pounded in my ears. I gripped the knife, half thinking I should try to scare them off, but I couldn't move. My legs felt numb. Then I heard a scrape at the window behind the armoire. The boards rattled. Something was pulling on them. I crawled closer to the corner, keeping my eyes on that gap. I saw a long, thin shape slide between two boards, like a hand or an arm. It reached in, but it couldn't find anything to grab. The buzzing got louder. I was sure that was the moment they would come in. My vision blurred for a second from panic. My chest was tight, and I had trouble getting a full breath. Then the arm pulled back. The buzzing shifted tone again, and I heard the footsteps retreat a little. Maybe they were regrouping or trying a different spot. I kept waiting for the next impact. I could barely swallow because my throat was dry. My stomach felt like it was tangled in knots. Instead, the noise began to fade again. The buzzing lowered, like a swarm moving away. The steps seemed to shuffle back across the porch, then around the side of the chalet. My heart still hammered, but I felt a small flicker of relief. They weren't gone entirely. I could still sense them out there, but they were farther away. The hours crept toward dawn. and I stayed in the same spot, breathing carefully, trying not to make any sound. By the time the sun started to light the sky, I didn't hear them anymore. I peered through the gap in the barricade. No one was there, but the footprints around the porch were heavier, more scattered. They definitely tried to get inside. I think they're just waiting for the right moment. Now it's daylight. I'm writing this down because I need to keep my mind straight. My nerves are shot. I keep glancing at the windows and doors, triple-checking my barricades. Every little noise outside makes me flinch. I've got a feeling they'll come back again tonight, maybe in larger numbers, or maybe with more force. My stomach cramps at the thought. I can almost hear that buzzing right now, echoing in my head. I'm not sure what they are or why they're targeting this place, but I know they're not giving up. I feel vulnerable, exposed. It's only a matter of time before they try harder to get in, and I'm not sure how much longer I can keep them out. I still remember the day I got the invitation. It arrived in a plain envelope with my name scrawled in tight slanted letters. The note inside was short. It said there was a collector who owned a private library full of rare books. He heard about my interest in old volumes and asked if I wanted to visit. The note gave me no details, only a date and an address. It felt abrupt, but I didn't hesitate. I had always searched for obscure tomes and hidden treasures. This sounded like a chance I couldn't ignore. I drove out on a Thursday afternoon. The address led me to a large estate tucked behind tall iron gates. The grounds were quiet. The grass looked overgrown, and a stone path led to a front door with a tarnished knocker shaped like a dragon's head. I knocked once. No one answered at first, but then an older man in a black suit opened the door. He nodded, didn't say his name, and beckoned me inside. The foyer smelled of old wood. The walls were lined with paintings of people I didn't recognize. None of them seemed to smile. The man in the suit led me down a long corridor. Every few steps I saw small niches holding strange artifacts. An ancient mask here, a stone figurine there. He walked fast. His shoes clicked on the marble floor. I didn't speak because I felt an odd tension, like I was walking into a place not meant for me. After several turns, we stopped in front of two massive wooden doors. He pushed them open with a slow, deliberate motion. Inside was a library unlike any I'd ever seen. The ceiling arched high above. Shelves towered on every wall and formed neat rows in the center. The room smelled of leather, dust, and something stale. A single chandelier cast a weak yellow glow, and there were only a few reading lamps scattered around. The library felt cramped and huge at the same time. I could see row after row of books, some thick, some thin, many in languages I didn't recognize. Most had spines covered in script I couldn't read. Some had symbols etched into the leather. The shelves themselves had carvings of runes and small geometric shapes. It looked like everything in this library had been put here with great care. I saw a man standing near a large oak desk at the center of the room. He was tall and thin, with close-cropped gray hair. He wore a dark blazer and no tie. When I approached him, he extended his hand and introduced himself as the owner of the collection. His voice was calm. He told me he'd heard I was interested in rare books, and said he had some items I might find intriguing. I asked him where he found them. He just smiled. He pointed toward the rows, said I could browse, and warned me to handle everything gently. Then he excused himself, leaving me alone. I remember the silence in that moment. The library felt heavy, like the air had a weight that pressed against my skin. I began walking among the shelves. Each section seemed to house a different theme. One had old Latin texts I recognized by the shape of the letters. Another contained volumes bound in what looked like black fabric. Many of the titles had symbols instead of words, like circles, lines, or small stars. I heard a faint drip sound somewhere in the room, like water hitting stone, but I couldn't see any leak. Occasionally, I heard what I thought was a low hum, but I couldn't be sure if it was just my ears adjusting to the silence. I came across one shelf filled with books that looked older than anything I'd seen before. Their covers had cracks, and their pages were a yellowish brown. One had a spine decorated with a row of strange letters I'd never seen. I lifted it carefully. It felt cold, the texture was rough, and the corners seemed brittle. I placed it on a small reading table nearby and opened it. The first page had rows of symbols in black ink. Some resembled shapes that reminded me of runes. Others looked like scribbles. As I flipped through the pages, I felt a slight headache form behind my eyes. My chest tightened and my breathing felt shallow. The paper smelled of mold and something metallic. The ink seemed fresh, which confused me. It shone under the reading lamp. I turned one page too quickly and the paper made a scratching sound. I blinked. Suddenly, my vision blurred. My throat clenched. I felt a strange pressure on my temples, then a sudden rush of dizziness. My arms went weak, and I had to rest my elbows on the table to keep from falling. That's when I saw something. It was like a flash, but lasted long enough for me to register details. I saw walls of stone, flickering torchlight, and a long corridor that twisted out of sight. The corridor had a floor made of rough stones. I heard shuffling sounds like creatures dragging themselves in the dark. Then I felt a rush of cold air, and I was back in the library, hunched over the book. I nearly dropped it. My palms were sweaty. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I looked around. The library was the same, quiet and still. No one was nearby. The hum was gone, or maybe I couldn't hear it anymore. I closed the book gently. My hands shook and I sat there for a moment, trying to calm down. I wasn't sure what just happened. It felt like a vivid hallucination. I hadn't had anything to drink or any medication that could cause that. Part of me wanted to put the book back and leave, but my curiosity was too strong. I placed the book on a different shelf, hoping I could remember where to find it later. Then I wandered back toward the exit. Before I could reach the doors, the collector returned. He looked at me with an unreadable expression. He asked if I'd found anything interesting. I told him I'd seen some unusual items, but left out the vision. He nodded, smiled politely, and escorted me to the foyer. On my way out, he handed me a small card. It had a phone number and his name, but no address. He said I could call if I had questions. Then he shut the door behind me. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying those images. The corridor, the crawling shapes in the corners, the damp stone walls. When I did drift off, I dreamed I was inside a library that never ended. The shelves stretched in all directions, and I couldn't see an exit. The floor was made of black and white tiles that formed patterns. I walked slowly, hearing my footsteps echo. Then I heard faint whispers. They were soft at first, then grew louder. They surrounded me, but I couldn't tell which direction they came from. My mouth felt dry and I started to sweat. I tried to run, but the aisles seemed to change positions. The shelves rearranged themselves, cutting me off. I woke up gasping. My shirt was soaked in sweat and my pulse hammered in my throat. The next day I tried to focus on my usual routine. I had work to do, bills to pay, errands to run. But every time I paused, I remembered that library. I remembered the feeling of the pages under my fingers and that sudden, overwhelming vision. My arms tensed up at the memory. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just a momentary thing, maybe triggered by the musty smell or a slight panic attack. But deep down, I felt uneasy. That night, the dream came back. This time, I saw the same endless rows of shelves. I heard the whispers again, but I also saw something move at the corner of my vision. I turned my head to look, but it disappeared. I kept hearing that shuffling sound, like something wet dragging across the floor. My legs felt heavy and my chest tightened. I could barely breathe. Then a voice hissed my name. I didn't recognize the tone. It sounded harsh, like metal scraping stone. I woke up in a panic. My mouth was dry and my heart thudded in my chest. I got up, walked around my apartment, checked every corner like I expected to find someone hiding. The lights felt too bright, and the quiet felt threatening. Over the next few days, I noticed I wasn't just having nightmares. I started hearing small noises during the day. In my apartment, I heard soft tapping sounds at night. I'd check the windows, but there was nothing. Sometimes I'd see a shadow from the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was only an empty wall. My nerves were shot. I tried ignoring it, but it felt like that experience in the collector's library had opened a door in my mind. I didn't tell anyone because I wasn't sure what to say. It sounded crazy. One evening, I sat on my couch, flipping through channels. I felt something cold on the back of my neck. I froze. It lasted a second, like a hand brushing against my skin. I jerked up, spun around, but saw nothing. My lamp started flickering. My stomach churned. My mouth went dry. My hands shook. I realized I was holding my breath. I forced myself to breathe in and out slowly. Then everything seemed normal again, except my heart wouldn't slow down. I slept with the lights on that night. I called the number on the card the collector gave me. It rang several times before a recorded message told me the mailbox was full. I tried again the next day. Same message. I tried searching for his name online, but I didn't find anything that looked legit. It was like the man didn't exist outside that house. I thought about driving back to the estate, but I felt anxious about seeing him. I wasn't sure I wanted to step back into that library. The memory of that book made me queasy. The nightmares kept getting stronger. I found myself standing in that endless library night after night. The murmurings turned into a continuous drone. It felt like thousands of voices speaking all at once. My ears ached from the intensity. My throat closed up. Sometimes I'd see shapes moving on the shelves like figures crouched among the books, peeking at me with shining eyes. Other times I'd see glimpses of those stone corridors as though the library and the underground maze were connected. I felt lost. My clothes in the dream were always damp, and the air smelled like ancient dust and rotting paper. One night, I heard something scraping along the floor behind me. I turned and saw a shape that looked twisted and low to the ground. I only caught a glimpse because my fear spiked, and I jolted awake. My sheets were wet with sweat. My limbs felt stiff, like I'd been tensed up for hours. My heart pounded so hard that I thought it might give out. I sat up, turned on every light in my bedroom, and sat there until sunrise. I tried to calm myself by breathing slowly. I could still feel an awful tingling in my arms. During the day, I started feeling a constant pressure in my head, like my brain was swollen. My eyes would tear up for no reason. I lost my appetite because I felt nauseated. At work, I struggled to concentrate. I heard random noises in quiet moments, like pages turning. I also felt like someone was behind me whenever I walked into a dark room. When I tried to sleep at night, I'd twitch myself awake at the slightest noise. And whenever I did drift off, I ended up back in that library, running from those whispers. It never changed. I was always trapped there, searching for an exit that didn't exist. One afternoon, I tried to do some research on runes, thinking maybe I could find a clue about the symbols I'd seen. I went through old references online. Most of it was incomplete or contradictory. I discovered that runes had many variations, and some were linked to obscure cults or hidden societies. This information only made me more nervous. I spent hours scrolling through websites, but none of it gave me a clear answer. My eyes burned from staring at the screen, and my mind felt restless. That night, I skipped dinner. I went to bed early, hoping to at least get some sleep before the nightmare came. The dream was intense. I was in the library with my fingers brushing against the spines of ancient volumes. I heard dripping water somewhere in the distance. My pulse was loud in my ears. Then I saw a passage between two shelves that I was sure hadn't been there before. I stepped through and found myself in a narrow corridor with walls of piled books instead of stone. Everything smelled like mildew. The corridor went on, twisting left and right, forcing me to turn blindly. My hands trembled as I touched the damp covers on either side. I kept going until I reached a circular area. The floor was covered in scattered pages torn from books. I picked one up. It had the same runes I'd seen in that old volume. They looked like they were drawn with dark red ink. My stomach lurched at the sight of it. Then I felt a presence behind me, and all the hair on my arms stood up. I heard breathing, but I didn't look back. I woke up in a panic before I could see what it was. When morning came, I found scratches on my arm. They were small and shallow, but definitely new. I had no pets. I had no memory of hurting myself. My bedroom was free of anything sharp except maybe the corners of my bedside table. But these scratches looked more like marks from small claws or nails. My nerves were shot. My eyes stung from lack of sleep. My shoulders felt tight, and my legs felt weak. I needed some relief. I made a decision to go back to that house. I wanted answers. I called out sick from work, got in my car, and drove to the estate. The gates were still open. I walked up to the front door and found it unlocked. The foyer was dark. The paintings on the walls looked even gloomier than before. I called out, but no one answered. I walked down the corridor, passing those artifacts in their niches, feeling a chill run through my body. My palms were clammy. The door to the library was closed. I pushed it open, but the lights were off. No one was inside. I stood there, staring at the shelves. It felt the same, that heavy silence pressing on me. I looked for the book with the runes on the spine. I retraced my steps to the table where I first opened it. The table was there, but the book was gone. My throat felt tight. I checked the surrounding shelves, scanning the spines, looking for that unique set of symbols. I couldn't find it. I searched for at least an hour, walking up and down each aisle, ignoring the dust that made me sneeze. My heart thumped in my chest the entire time. I saw no sign of the collector or the old man in the suit. It was as if they'd vanished. Eventually, I had to leave. The silence got to me. My breathing was too shallow, and my hands were starting to shake again. I got back to my apartment, locked the door, and stood there in my entrance, listening for any sound. I could hear my fridge humming and my radiator clicking. No whispers, no scratching. I felt a slight relief. That night, I tried to stay awake as long as I could. I drank coffee and kept the TV on, flipping through channels just for noise. Around 3 a.m, I dozed off. The dream came fast. I saw the stone corridors again, and the library, fused together into one endless place. Everything reeked of damp paper and stale air. I was running, but my body felt heavy, like I was trying to wade through thick mud. The whispers rose and fell, sounding angry. I heard my name in those sounds. Then, in the dream, I looked down at my hand. I saw small red markings on my skin. They pulsed like a heartbeat. I tried to rub them off, but they stayed. That's when I realized something was behind me. I heard its breath on my neck. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I bolted awake, drenched in sweat, my muscles sore from tensing. Now, even as I sit here recounting all of this, I have that same feeling, that I'm not alone. My apartment is silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. My chest is tight and my fingertips are cold. Every so often I look around to check for a shadow or a flicker of movement. Sometimes I hear a soft shuffle, but it might be my neighbor or maybe the pipes. Either way, I can't shake the tension. I can't dismiss it as just nightmares. It feels real. I notice new scratches sometimes, or I find my books at odd angles on the shelf. I keep thinking about that corridor of stone and those shapes crawling in the darkness. The memory of that one volume haunts me. My body reacts whenever I recall the feel of its pages. I keep my phone next to me, but the number on that card remains useless. I can't reach the collector, and I've never seen that old man again. I've tried searching for him one last time, but there's no record of him or his library. It feels like I'm stuck with this on my own. I'm convinced something followed me out of that place. I can't see it, but I can feel it. It's in the corner of my eye, in the quiet moments, in the flickering lights. I'm writing this down because it helps me focus. I'm not looking for sympathy. I just need to keep track of what's happening. I'm prepared to face it, even though I don't know what it is. I'll keep checking every corner, every locked door, every shadow. The thought that a piece of that library came with me everywhere I go is enough to keep me on edge. But I don't see any other way. This is my life now until I find a solution. Maybe I can track down that book again. Maybe it's in some other part of that house. Maybe the collector has it. Or maybe it moved on its own. I don't know anymore. All I do know is that I'm not sleeping well. Each time I close my eyes, I'm there again, lost in those aisles, hearing those whispers. I wake up feeling drained, like I've been walking for miles. The lines between dream and reality keep blurring. I'm ready for another night with too little sleep, another sudden jolt awake at 3 in the morning. And I'm ready for whatever I might see when I open my eyes, because it seems determined to stay with me. If something came out of that dream, it's here now. I can't prove it, but I feel it in every breath, in the cold sting on the back of my neck, and in the quiet moments that last just a second too long. I got the cabin after my grandfather passed away. I drove up the dirt road on a cloudy afternoon, parked in front of the old wooden porch, and stared at the place. The logs were dark with age, and the windows were small. There was a hint of musty smell the moment I opened the door. I felt an uneasy jolt in my stomach, but I brushed it off. I told myself it was just nerves from being somewhere new and old at the same time. Still, I couldn't ignore the strange feeling in my gut. It felt like something was waiting inside, watching from the shadows. I walked in with my bags and left them near the couch. The living room was cramped, with old chairs and a sofa that looked faded. The walls were covered in dusty pictures of my grandfather's younger years, along with images of mountains and old-fashioned family gatherings. I flipped on a switch, but the light bulb sputtered a bit before it settled. The cabin had electricity, but it felt weak. The wires must have been ancient. I noticed a small door to the side of the living room. Behind it, there was a narrow staircase leading up. I remembered my grandfather's stories about a big attic stuffed with old luggage and antiques. He used to call it his personal storage unit. I used to think he was exaggerating. I looked at the door for a moment, then I climbed the stairs. The steps groaned under my weight. At the top, I spotted a single overhead bulb hanging from the ceiling. The attic space was cluttered. There were rows of suitcases piled along the walls and random furniture under faded sheets. I took a few steps on the creaking floorboards. Dust floated in the light like tiny specks. I smelled old leather, mold, and mothballs. I saw a few trunks that looked locked, some metal boxes, and a few wooden crates. When I looked down, I noticed scratch marks on the floor. They were long and thin, arranged in odd patterns near the center of the attic. It didn't look like normal wear and tear. It looked more like something sharp had dragged across the boards. I thought maybe some animal had gotten in. The cabin was in the mountains, so it was possible. I ran my fingertips over the grooves. They were deep. It made me a bit uneasy. I took a brief look around. The place felt cramped, even though it was a large attic. It might have been the piles of stuff looming over me. A few suitcases teetered near the edges of the stacks. I saw an old rocking chair in the corner, next to a tall lamp with a torn lampshade. The chair's seat was covered in dust, yet the floor around it looked like someone had moved across it. There were footprints or smudges in the dust. I didn't recall anyone coming up here since my grandfather's passing. I didn't dwell on it for too long, though. The smell of the attic was unpleasant, and I was tired from the long drive. I left the attic and went back down to the living room. By then, the sun was setting. The inside of the cabin felt dim and cold. I checked the stove in the small kitchen area and found out it was a gas stove that still worked. I cooked a quick meal of canned soup and some bread I brought along. While I ate, I listened to the wind outside. It rattled the windows a bit. There was no other sound, so every little noise seemed louder than it should have been. After dinner, I sat on the old couch. I leaned my head back, thinking about my grandfather. He was a quiet man, but he always seemed to have secrets. I shrugged off that thought. I grabbed my bag and fished out some clothes for the night. I was planning to sleep in the cabin's only bedroom, which was down a short hallway. The bed in there was simple, a twin bed with an old quilt. I switched on a small lamp on the nightstand. Its glow was faint. Then I heard something from above. It sounded like a faint dragging noise across the ceiling. I froze for a second, trying to focus on the sound. It was like something was sliding across the attic floorboards. Then it stopped. My heart thumped. My breath got shallow. I told myself it was probably just the wind or an animal. I thought about the scratch marks I saw earlier. Maybe there was a raccoon or something up there. I felt uneasy, but I was too exhausted to deal with it. I decided I would check it out in the morning. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The lamp was still on. I didn't want to turn it off because I didn't feel comfortable in the dark. Eventually, my eyes got heavy, and I dozed off. But at some point, I woke up to a whispering sound. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It was more like muffled chatter, right over my head. I sat up in bed and waited. My heart was racing. The whispering continued for a few seconds, then stopped. I heard a short scraping noise. I got up, grabbed a flashlight, and left the bedroom. I walked carefully to the living room, looking up at the ceiling. The cabin felt colder now, and the air smelled stale. I stood there listening. Nothing. Total silence. I went back to bed, leaving the flashlight beside me. I didn't sleep well. My dreams were restless, full of half-formed images of my grandfather and the attic. When morning came, I felt groggy. I made instant coffee on the gas stove and looked around the living room. The floor looked normal, but I noticed the attic door. It seemed slightly ajar, even though I remembered closing it. I cursed under my breath, assuming maybe the latch was loose. I grabbed a hammer from the small toolkit I found in the kitchen drawer and went to check the door. The latch wasn't broken, but it felt shaky. I forced it shut again and tested it. It held, but I wasn't entirely confident. I decided to go upstairs to investigate once more. I walked up the creaky stairs to the attic, carrying the flashlight and a broom in case I needed to scare off an animal. The overhead bulb up there was weak, so I wanted the extra light. The attic smelled even mustier than before. It felt like the temperature dropped a few degrees. As I scanned the space, I noticed some suitcases had shifted positions. One that was standing upright on the right side was now lying on its side near the center of the attic. I didn't recall moving it. The scratch marks on the floor looked more pronounced. I walked around, tapping the broom handle against boxes and crates to see if anything would jump out. Nothing did. The attic was quiet except for the hum of the overhead bulb. I pulled the chain on the bulb, turning it off and on to see if maybe the wiring was causing weird noises. It seemed fine. I checked corners and behind stacks. All I found was dust, old papers, and some broken chairs. No sign of an animal. I felt a chill crawl along my arms. I left the attic and closed the door behind me again. I spent the rest of the day cleaning the living room and the kitchen area. I opened a few windows to air the place out. A cool breeze came in, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth from outside. I tried to put the attic out of my mind, but I couldn't forget the whispering sound. I considered driving back to the nearest town to grab some supplies or even call someone to help me check for animals, but I decided to stay. I felt stubborn about it. It was my grandfather's cabin, and I wanted to handle it on my own. In the late afternoon, the clouds came in thicker, and it started to drizzle. The roof made a steady tapping sound as the rain hit it. I lit a small fire in the old fireplace. It crackled and popped, giving me a bit of warmth. I found some old logs on the porch. I sat in front of the fire reading through an old notebook I found in the drawer of the end table. It was filled with my grandfather's scribbles about maintenance dates and lists of things to fix. I saw a few references to the attic. One note said, "Strange sounds again, need to check insulation." That was dated about 2 years ago. Another note said, "Attic rearranged? Could be my own fault. Must keep track." That one made me pause. I decided to fix myself a quick dinner. I had canned chili and some crackers. I ate in silence, listening to the rain. Then I heard a faint scraping from above. It was soft, but it was there. I put my spoon down and waited. My heart started racing. The sound came and went like something was shifting across the attic floor. I stood up and walked to the attic door. I pressed my ear against it. The scraping continued for a moment, then stopped. I felt goosebumps rising on my arms. My breathing got shallow. I waited a bit, but I didn't hear it again. That night, I decided to sleep on the couch in the living room. I didn't want to be directly under the attic. The couch wasn't comfortable. The cushions sagged, and the fabric smelled old. But I felt safer there with a clear view of the attic door. I left the lamp on next to me, and I also had my flashlight within reach. After an hour or so, I started to doze off. My eyes kept closing despite my nerves. Sometime during the night, I woke up to a low whisper coming from above. I froze, gripping the edge of the couch. My mind started racing. I told myself it was just old wood settling or wind in the rafters, but it sounded too much like someone whispering. Then I felt the slightest brush against my shoulder, like fingertips grazing my skin. I jumped up, swinging my flashlight around. I saw nothing. My heart hammered. My breath felt hot in my lungs. I didn't see any movement. I stood there, my hands shaking, pointing the flashlight in every corner of the living room. Everything looked the same. The front door was locked. The windows were shut. I aimed the beam at the attic door, but it was still closed. I paced around the living room. I couldn't relax. Eventually, I sat back down, but I kept the flashlight on. My thoughts were jumbled. I wondered if I was just too tired and imagining things, but it felt real. My shoulder still tingled where I felt that light touch. I stayed awake for hours, jumping at every small noise. When dawn arrived, the tension eased a bit. In the morning, I decided I needed to do a thorough search of the attic. I felt determined to find whatever was up there. I put on a jacket and some work gloves, grabbed a crowbar from the toolkit, and headed upstairs. I pulled the attic door open. The stairs creaked in protest. When I reached the attic, I turned on the overhead light and also used my flashlight to sweep across the area. The air felt stale and cold, with no windows to let light in. I moved suitcases around, looking behind them. I checked inside a few that were unlocked. They held old clothes, papers, and random keepsakes, nothing out of the ordinary. I opened the crates. Some held old books, some had random tools, and one had a bunch of broken frames and glass. I was sweating despite the cool air because I was tense and on edge the whole time. Every time I heard a creak, I spun around, expecting to see something, but the attic was empty of people or animals. I noticed more scratch marks on the floor near the far end of the attic. This area was behind a tall dresser that was draped with a white sheet. I pulled the sheet off. The dresser was heavy and had a big mirror on top. The glass was dirty. I ran my hand across the front of the dresser. The drawers were locked. I tried prying one open, but it wouldn't budge, so I left it. On the floor in front of the dresser, the boards were gouged with more deep scratches. It looked like the dresser had been moved back and forth, or something had crawled under it. I crouched down and shined my flashlight. I saw dust and some strands of old spider webs, but nothing else. By the time I finished searching, it was late morning. I left the attic feeling frustrated. I hadn't found anything that would explain the noises or the whispering. I decided to step outside for some fresh air. The sky was clear, and the mountain scenery was calm. The crisp air steadied my nerves. I walked around the cabin, checking for any openings in the roof or walls where an animal could enter. I saw a few loose shingles, but nothing that looked big enough for a raccoon or anything like that. I kept wondering if the place was somehow messing with my head. In the afternoon, I went back inside and sat at the table with my notes. I had written down every strange occurrence: the whispering, the scratch marks, the moved suitcases, the attic door left ajar, and that weird feeling of being touched. I drank coffee and stared at the words. I didn't know how to solve any of it. I felt a spike of dread at the idea of staying another night, but I also felt a pull that made me want to figure this out. I didn't want to abandon my grandfather's cabin at the first sign of something strange. As evening fell, I locked every door and window. I checked the attic latch twice. Then I built another fire in the fireplace. I sat there, warming my hands, listening to the crackle. The smell of burning wood filled the room, mixing with the old, stale smell of the cabin. The silence pressed in on me again. Every now and then, the wood in the fire popped, and I would jump slightly. My nerves were on edge. When I finally turned in for the night, I decided to sleep in the bedroom again. I thought maybe the couch was making me too jumpy. I left a small lamp on, plus the flashlight by my pillow. I closed my eyes, trying to think of normal things, like errands I had to run back in the city. But the only thing on my mind was the attic. Sleep eventually came, but it was restless. I woke several times, glancing at the ceiling, afraid I'd hear that scraping or whispering again. Around 2 in the morning, I heard a creak from the attic, followed by a faint thump. My eyes shot open. My heart pounded, and I felt sweat forming on my forehead. I sat up and gripped the flashlight. The thump echoed once more, like something heavy was moved or dropped. I felt my breath speed up. I got out of bed and walked to the living room, shining my flashlight at the attic door. It was still shut, but I heard another slight sound from above. I stood there, my hand trembling around the flashlight. I had no idea what to do. A cold draft blew across my neck. I thought I felt the faintest brush on my shoulder again. I spun around, shining the light everywhere. Nothing. I was alone. My stomach twisted in knots. I stepped up to the attic door and gripped the doorknob. I was shaking, but I opened it and aimed my flashlight up the stairs. I could only see the top landing. Everything was dark and still. I listened for another sound. All I heard was my own breathing. I stood there for a long moment, unsure if I should go up or slam the door shut and run. Eventually, I backed away and closed the door again. I locked it, returned to the couch, and sat there until morning, wide awake and alert. That was my 3rd night in the cabin, and I knew something was off. Objects were moving around, I was hearing voices, and I felt touches I couldn't explain. I kept looking at the pictures of my grandfather on the walls, wondering if he ever experienced the same thing. His old notebook suggested he did, but I had no direct proof. I was stuck in a cycle of fear and doubt. I couldn't explain any of it logically, and I hated feeling helpless. Now, as I sit here in the kitchen, I'm staring at the attic door again. I don't hear anything at the moment, but I feel a tightness in my chest every time I look at that door. My plan is to stay one more night, then head back to town for extra supplies. Maybe I'll bring a friend next time to see if they notice anything unusual. I'm not sure if I can handle another night of whispers and touches in the dark, but I can't ignore it. This cabin is mine now, and something in that attic wants me to know it's here. I don't know what I'll find if I keep searching through the suitcases and boxes. I don't know if I'll ever see a face attached to those whispers. All I know is that this place feels charged with an energy that makes my skin crawl. My grandfather left me this cabin, and maybe he knew I would uncover whatever lurks upstairs. It's not what I expected from an inheritance, but it's what I have. Right now, I'm going to finish my coffee, lock the attic door again, and wait for the sun to set. I'm on edge, but I'm not ready to give up. If something is in that attic, it hasn't driven me out yet, and I want to know what it is. I never planned on living in an old Victorian mansion on a lonely hill, but the price was right, and I needed a change. The house stood 3 stories tall, with chipped paint on the exterior walls and a rotting fence near the entrance. When I arrived, I noticed the windows were covered with thick faded curtains, the driveway was cracked and uneven, and the front steps groaned under my weight. I felt a chill in the air before I even stepped inside. The real estate agent warned me it would need a lot of work, but I didn't expect it to feel so hollow. I remember standing in the foyer and smelling dust and stale air. The silence felt heavy, like the house had been waiting for someone to make noise again. I tried to laugh it off in my head, but my stomach stayed tense. I started exploring room by room. Most of the doors were stuck or creaked so loud it made me wince. The carpets were old and stiff, and the wallpaper peeled off in long strips that sometimes fell on the floor when I touched them. The furniture left behind looked outdated and scratched up, with missing drawers and broken legs. I noticed a constant layer of dust on everything. My footsteps left tracks on the floor. Occasionally, I heard my own breathing echo in the halls. Late in the afternoon, I came across a locked door on the 1st floor. I tugged at the doorknob, but it refused to budge. I found a set of keys in the study, where a large oak desk still stood against a wall with a cracked mirror above it. One of the keys fit the lock on the mysterious door. The hinges screeched as I pushed the door open. The room on the other side was large and dim. It smelled stale, like an attic that hadn't been aired out in decades. I walked in and realized it was some kind of old-fashioned ballroom or large parlor. Heavy curtains covered tall windows, and the floor had black and white tiles that felt cold under my feet even through my shoes. I soon spotted rows of mirrors lining the walls. Each mirror was covered with a dusty cloth. Some looked small enough for a bathroom sink, while others reached from the floor to the ceiling. They were all shapes: rectangular, oval, round. The fabrics covering them were different colors, but all were faded and stained with dirt. I brushed my hand against one of the cloths, and a small cloud of dust rose into the air, making me cough and step back. I decided not to touch anything else for the moment. I left the mirror room alone that evening. I was tired and wanted to rest, but I kept thinking about those mirrors. I tried to ignore a slight feeling of unease. I've always been okay with old houses, but there was something about that hidden room full of mirrors that made me uneasy. The air had felt heavier in there. I told myself I was just jumpy from moving into a place with so much history and dust. That night, I managed to get some sleep, but the wind outside howled against the windows. I heard branches hitting the house, and the walls creaked at random intervals. Around midnight, I woke up to a dull thump from downstairs. My heart started beating fast. I sat up in bed, straining to hear more. At first it was quiet again, so I thought maybe it was the wind or something falling off a shelf. Then I heard another dull sound, like a heavy object dropping on the floor. I felt a tightness in my chest, but I got up and grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand. I crept into the hallway and aimed the beam of light down the stairs. The wooden steps looked warped in the shadows. I walked slowly, each step creaking under my weight. At the bottom, I turned toward the door leading to the large parlor. The air felt colder there. My breath caught in my throat when I noticed the door was slightly open. I remembered closing it before I went to bed. I pushed it open the rest of the way, and the flashlight revealed the shape of those cloth-covered mirrors. One cloth lay crumpled on the floor, and I saw a mirror without its cover. The glass was cloudy, and I caught my own reflection. It looked blurry, like someone had breathed on it. I approached the uncovered mirror, shining the flashlight across its surface. My reflection stared back, but something was off. It was barely visible, kind of transparent, and I noticed that my reflection didn't move in sync with me. I lifted my left hand, but my reflection raised its right hand. It was slow, like it was studying me. My mouth felt dry, and my heart hammered in my ears. I felt goosebumps on my arms, and for a moment my breathing stopped. I leaned in closer, swallowing hard. My reflection tilted its head when I didn't. I turned my head to the side, but the reflection stayed still, eyes forward. My scalp tingled, and I dropped the flashlight. It clattered against the tile, and the light spun around. I picked it up quickly, shining it back at the mirror. My reflection appeared normal again, matching my every movement. My legs felt weak, and I stepped back. I scanned the rest of the room with the flashlight, trying to find an open window or something that could explain why the cloth fell. The windows were all closed, and I didn't see any sign of animals. My mind raced with questions, but I decided I'd had enough for one night. I covered the mirror again and left the parlor in a hurry. After returning to my bedroom, I locked the door and stood there in silence, trying to calm my breathing. My chest felt tight and my palms were sweaty. I stayed awake for hours, watching shadows on the walls whenever the wind blew. The next morning, I felt groggy, but I forced myself to check the parlor again. I opened the door cautiously and found everything as I left it, with the mirror covered. Nothing seemed out of place, but I felt a lingering heaviness. My mind kept replaying that reflection, not moving with me. I decided to leave the house for a bit. I drove into town to pick up groceries and basic cleaning supplies. While in town, I asked a local hardware store owner if he knew anything about the old mansion on the hill. He said it had been empty for years. People talked about strange drafts and weird noises there, but nothing specific. I didn't want to press him for more details. I just said thanks, bought what I needed, and headed back. Over the next few days, I spent time cleaning the house, patching holes, and checking the heating system. I tried to avoid the mirror room, but I could feel an uneasy sensation any time I walked by that door. Sometimes I thought I heard faint creaks coming from inside, but I told myself it was just normal settling. I also thought I felt eyes on me whenever I passed by a mirror in the hallway or the bathroom upstairs. My own reflection felt off, but I tried to push those thoughts out of my head. I felt my nerves getting raw. Simple noises made me jump. I caught myself looking over my shoulder when I went around corners or when I opened a closet. One evening, I decided to face my fear. I went to the parlor and turned on all the lights I could. Some bulbs were dead, so the room remained dim. I pulled the covers off every mirror, trying to examine them. Dust filled the air and I coughed while tugging on those old cloths. The mirrors were different styles and I guess they were collected over time. Some frames were carved with elaborate patterns, some were simple wooden rectangles, and others looked more modern. I tried to see if there was anything special about them besides their age. Most just seemed worn, with tarnished surfaces. A few had cracks or edges that were splintered. I moved around the room, shining a small lamp across each mirror's surface. I glanced at my reflection over and over, expecting it to move out of sync again. It never happened while I was looking, but I had this crawling sensation on my skin, like someone watched me from behind the glass. My heart thumped harder whenever I looked away, as if something wanted me to turn my back. After checking them all, I didn't find any secret compartments or hidden sensors. I was left with a nagging feeling I couldn't explain. I covered them again even though it felt pointless and stepped out. For a while, nothing else happened. I kept myself busy cleaning the attic, pulling out old boxes and dealing with leaky pipes. The nights remained unsettling though. I'd hear random taps on the walls or the house would shift and groan in ways that set my teeth on edge. Some nights I slept with the door locked and I left a lamp on. I felt silly, but I preferred having some light. Then on the fifth night I had a jolt of terror around 2 a.m. I got up to use the bathroom and passed by the tall mirror in the hallway. I glanced at my reflection for a second, then I froze. I saw someone else behind me in the reflection, a silhouette that stood in the dark corner near the stairs. My throat went dry and I whipped around, shining my phone's flashlight. The hallway was empty. I stared at the corner, my pulse pounding in my neck. There was nobody there. When I looked back at the mirror, there was only my reflection. My arms felt shaky, and I walked quickly back to the bedroom, locking the door again. The next morning, I felt drained. I made coffee and stood in the kitchen, looking out at the trees outside. The view from the hill was actually pretty nice in daylight, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off inside. I told myself maybe I was just seeing things because I was stressed. I decided to open windows and let fresh air in. I went room by room, raising dusty blinds and propping windows open. The house smelled less stale afterward, but I still felt uneasy. My shoulders remained tense and I couldn't relax. That evening I caught my reflection in a window. The sun was setting, and the window acted like a partial mirror. For a split second I thought I saw my face blinking, but I wasn't blinking. My stomach lurched and I stepped away from the window. I tried to breathe slowly, telling myself it was a trick of the light. The tension in my chest stayed though, and I felt restless. I paced around the living room, turning lamps on as it got dark. I kept looking at the windows, half expecting to see something out there. When bedtime came, I lay awake, listening to the old house settle. Around midnight I heard that dull thud again, followed by a soft scraping noise. My body tensed up. I got out of bed and grabbed my flashlight, trying not to make a sound. My heart was thumping so hard I thought it would drown out everything else. I walked into the hallway, shining the light around. The floor felt cold under my bare feet. I followed the sound to the staircase, then to the parlor. I paused outside the parlor door, noticing it was closed this time. I reached for the knob and my hand felt slick with sweat. I turned it slowly, pushing the door open an inch at a time. The hinges squeaked, and I winced. I swung the beam of the flashlight inside. Several of the mirror covers had slid off. They were on the floor, bunched up. The uncovered mirrors reflected my flashlight in odd angles, creating shifting patches of light on the walls. I stepped inside, my legs shaking. I swept the flashlight around and saw no one else in there. But I felt a presence. My skin prickled and every hair on my arm stood on end. Then I saw movement in one of the taller mirrors. At first I thought it was just me, but the reflection twisted in a way I wasn't standing. I froze. gripping the flashlight so tight my hand hurt. The reflection's head seemed to tilt at an unnatural angle. My spine tingled and my throat went tight. I backed away, my breath catching. I wanted to run, but I also felt rooted to the spot. My mind was screaming that this was impossible, but I couldn't deny what I saw. I swallowed hard and called out, "Is someone here?" My voice sounded shaky. There was no response. The reflection moved slightly as though it was adjusting its posture. My palms grew sweaty and my heartbeat pounded in my ears. I couldn't force myself to get any closer. I started backing up, keeping my eyes on the mirror. The reflection stepped forward while I stepped back. I felt panic stabbing at my chest. I turned around and bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me. Upstairs, I locked myself in the bedroom again. I tried to catch my breath. My limbs felt heavy, and my mind raced. I kept the light on all night. The next morning, I tried to come up with a plan. I wanted to get rid of those mirrors, or at least move them out of the house. But I couldn't do it alone, and I didn't want to explain this to anyone. I dreaded the idea of walking back in there by myself. I spent the day avoiding the parlor entirely, focusing on other chores. I noticed I wasn't eating much. I felt a constant knot in my stomach. Later that afternoon, I forced myself to open the parlor door again just to see if anything changed. The covers were still on the ground, but none of the mirrors were broken or moved. I felt a chill as I walked around, picking up the covers and trying to place them back. My arms trembled the whole time. I avoided looking directly into the glass. The sense of being watched was intense. My neck felt tight, and I kept turning to check behind me, expecting something to jump out. I managed to cover them all, but the fear in my chest didn't go away. I left the room, closed the door, and decided to keep it locked. Since then, I've felt a presence following me around the house, always just out of sight. Whenever I walk by a reflective surface like a window, a small mirror in the bathroom, or even a shiny piece of metal, I get a jolt of anxiety. Sometimes I glimpse what looks like a figure standing behind me, or a slight delay in my reflection's movements, but it's always gone when I look directly. I can't relax here. My muscles stay tense, and I startle at small sounds. I keep expecting to see that reflection twisting on its own. At night, I check each mirror, making sure they're covered or turned against the wall. Still, I sense something behind the glass, peering out at me. My chest tightens, and my breath grows shallow whenever I enter a dark room, because I'm worried there might be a mirror I forgot about. I try to tell myself it's just my imagination, that I'm letting my nerves get the best of me. But the feeling stays. It crawls up my spine. I don't know what's really in those mirrors. I don't know if it's part of me or something else. I'm not looking for logical answers anymore. I just want to keep my distance from them. I've started thinking of leaving the house altogether, maybe finding someone else to take it off my hands. But I'm afraid I'd be leaving with whatever presence has attached itself to me. Sometimes I look at my reflection and wonder if I'm still the same, or if something on the other side is waiting to show itself again. I stay alert, double-checking every reflection I pass. I can't shake the sensation of being watched, and I feel certain that it's not just me in those mirrors anymore. I see that slight tilt of the head or a strange pause in the reflection's eyes, and I know it's still there, following me, waiting for me to let my guard down. I never expected anything unusual when I pulled over that night. I just wanted to stretch my legs and clear my head. The road was dark, and I didn't see any lights in the distance. There was a thick layer of fog drifting across the pavement. It moved in slow waves, almost like it had a mind of its own. It felt like I was standing in front of a barrier between two different worlds. I had no idea what waited for me at that crossroads. I left my truck running at the side of the road. Its headlights cut through the fog, but not by much. I stepped away from the door and looked around. I could see an old wooden signpost. The paint was gone. The wood looked damp, and I thought I could smell rotting bark. The air was cold, and it smelled like wet leaves and dirt. I felt the moisture on my skin. My jacket wasn't thick, so I crossed my arms to keep warm. I thought I was alone, but then I noticed a shape in the distance. It didn't move. It was just standing there. I stared for a while, trying to make out if it was a tree stump, a post, or something else. It looked like a person. There wasn't enough light to see details. The fog rolled around this figure. It seemed to cling to its outline. My heart picked up a bit, and I felt a tingle on the back of my neck. I don't like meeting strangers in the middle of nowhere, especially at night. But I told myself it was probably another traveler. Maybe they needed help. I called out, "Hey, you okay?" And my voice sounded too loud in that silent place. It echoed in my ears. I waited for a response, but all I heard was the faint sound of wind pushing through the trees. The shape remained still. I took a few steps forward. Each step made a crunching sound against the loose gravel under my boots. I kept my eyes on that figure, but as I approached, the fog got thicker. For a second, I lost sight of the shape. Then, when I thought I was close enough to call out again, I realized it was gone. The spot was empty. I looked around, confused. The breeze shifted the fog, but I couldn't see anything anymore. I felt a flicker of tension in my stomach. My hands got a little clammy. I wiped them on my jeans and took one more glance around. Nothing. No footsteps, no voice, no sound. I shrugged it off as a trick of the light, or maybe my eyes were tired. I'd been driving for hours. I decided to let it go and get back into my truck. I stayed awake all night thinking about that shape. It wasn't normal for me to get spooked by things like that, but I couldn't forget how it just vanished. Usually, if someone's out there, they walk away or make some noise. This was different. It was like the fog swallowed them. I tried to focus on the road, but my mind kept jumping back to that moment. A few weeks later, I had to drive the same route again. It was late evening by the time I passed through that area. The fog was there, just like before, hanging over the crossroads. I felt a squeeze in my chest when I saw that familiar curve in the road. My headlights lit up the signpost for a second. It looked more damaged than I remembered. The paint was completely gone. I slowed down. I told myself I was just being careful because of the poor visibility, but the truth is, I was looking for that shape again. I parked on the shoulder and killed the engine this time. The night was quiet. I heard a few crickets in the distance. The chill in the air was sharper than last time. I stepped out and took a moment to listen. There was a mild rustling in the nearby bushes. I tried to see beyond the fog. Then I spotted it again. That shape stood about 30 feet away, closer than before, right behind the signpost. My breath caught in my throat. I felt my heart pounding in my ears. I took a step forward. The gravel crunched under my boots. The shape didn't move. I saw a pair of eyes. They looked dull, like there was no color in them at all. I froze for a second. My mind screamed that I shouldn't approach, but I forced my feet to move. I took another step, then another. When I was close enough to get a better look, the figure melted into the fog again like it had never been there. I whispered, "Where the hell did you go?" I felt my voice shake. My skin prickled and my gut twisted. I walked around the crossroads for a few minutes, searching for footprints or any sign of a person. The ground was damp. I saw puddles where my own boots left impressions, but there were no other marks anywhere. I felt like I was being played with, like something was messing with me on purpose. It wasn't a normal feeling. I felt a wave of unease in my chest. I felt my shoulders tighten. I hated that sensation. I climbed back into the truck and decided to keep driving. My eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror. Nothing was behind me, just the swirling fog. I could still see that pair of colorless eyes in my mind. They felt empty, like they belonged to something that had no soul. My hands shook on the steering wheel. I tried to calm myself by turning on the radio, but all I got was static. I shut it off and drove in silence. Over the next few weeks, I thought about that figure every time I drove at night. I wondered if it was a person with some condition, or if it was a leftover memory from my tired brain. Part of me knew something else was happening, but I tried not to dwell on it. I kept telling myself I was just tired. But when I heard about a job that required me to pass by that crossroads again, I felt a knot in my stomach. I left earlier in the day so I could reach the area before dark. I told myself it was just for safety, but I knew I was avoiding another encounter. The roads were empty again. The sun was low in the sky. Orange light cut across my windshield and blurred my vision. The day was pretty warm, and I was starting to think maybe I'd see nothing this time. Then, about a mile before the crossroads, I saw wisps of fog floating in the distance. My heart sank. The sun dipped below the horizon by the time I reached that spot. The fog looked thicker than before, like a wall. I slowed down and switched on my headlights. My chest felt tight. I gripped the steering wheel and tried to control my breathing. I told myself I'd just drive straight through. No stopping, no looking. But as I crept forward, something made me tap the brakes. It wasn't logic. It was curiosity or fear or both. I stopped right near the signpost. It looked more rotted than ever. Parts of the wood had broken off. There were no letters left on it. I stepped out and kept my truck door open. I turned on my flashlight. My hand felt sweaty around the handle. I took a deep breath and looked around. The sky was gray and starless. The fog rolled over my ankles. The air felt colder than usual, and I could smell the damp earth again. Then I saw the shape. This time it stood almost in front of me, maybe 10 feet away. I shone my flashlight on it. The light didn't reveal much, just a rough outline of a tall figure. Its eyes, though, were the first thing I noticed. They didn't reflect the light. They just looked blank. I felt a sharp jolt in my chest, like an adrenaline rush. My mouth went dry and I swallowed hard. I tried to say something, but my voice cracked. I managed a broken, "Hello?" The figure remained still. My hands shook. My flashlight beam trembled on its outline. I took one small step forward. My boots felt heavy and my legs felt stiff. Right before I got close enough to raise my hand in greeting, the figure disappeared again, the same way as before. No movement, no sound, just gone. I felt lightheaded. I had a buzz in my ears. I knew I needed to calm down. I heard my own breathing, loud and fast. I slowly backed up to my truck. I tossed the flashlight onto the passenger seat and climbed in. I locked the doors without really thinking. I sat there for a moment, staring at the empty road. The hair on my arms was standing on end. My heart hammered. I started the engine and rolled up the windows. As I drove away, I glanced in my side mirror. The figure was there again, behind the signpost, watching me leave. I almost slammed on the brakes, but I decided to keep going. I didn't want another close encounter. I didn't want to feel that hollow stare again. I kept driving until the fog was gone and the road felt normal, but I couldn't shake that feeling of being watched. I started avoiding that route whenever I could. I took longer drives, sometimes adding hours to my trips. But sometimes I had no choice. Work took me all over, and that forgotten crossroads was often the only road that made sense. Each time I approached, I felt a steady pulse of tension in my gut. Sometimes the figure appeared, sometimes it didn't. But every time I drove by, I felt its presence, like it was waiting for me to notice it. On one of those nights, I decided to do something different. I was tired of feeling hunted. I pulled over again, got out, and walked around for a long time. I paced back and forth near the signpost. I kept my flashlight in my hand, scanning the darkness. The wind picked up, and I heard branches creaking. I saw my breath in the cold air. After a while, my fingertips felt numb. I walked over to the edge of the road where there was a shallow ditch. The grass was wet and slippery. I almost lost my footing. I kept looking for any signs that another person might be around. I saw a couple of old beer cans on the ground, a broken glass bottle near some weeds, and a black plastic bag rustling in the breeze. I heard rustling sounds from beyond the ditch, maybe an animal moving through the undergrowth, but I didn't see the figure. My nerves felt stretched thin. My hands were shaking and my eyes kept darting around. Then I heard what sounded like a footstep on the gravel. I spun around, pointing my flashlight in that direction. My heart pounded. The shape was behind me, about 5 feet away, standing on the road. I could almost make out a pale face, but it was out of focus. I saw those blank eyes again. They stared at me. I felt a surge of panic. My mind went blank for a second. I just froze. Then I forced myself to speak. "Who are you?" My voice sounded shaky. The figure didn't respond. It stayed perfectly still. I felt a cold sweat on my forehead. My stomach twisted. My breathing got faster. I took a step closer. My flashlight flickered. I tapped it, but it kept dimming. I got just close enough to extend my hand. I wanted to see if I could touch this person. My fingertips brushed against something cold. It felt like air, but thicker. Then the figure disappeared again, leaving me alone in the darkness. My flashlight turned off completely and I cursed under my breath. I stumbled back to my truck, fumbling for my keys. I got the engine running, turned on the headlights and slammed the door shut. I felt exposed out there. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grip the wheel. I drove away as fast as I could without spinning out on the wet road. Later that night, I kept replaying those moments in my head. I remembered the way the shape looked closer each time, the way its eyes never showed any emotion. I felt like it was trying to get closer to me, inch by inch, every time I returned. It never spoke. It never made a sound. It just appeared, stared, and vanished. I've been through that crossroads a few more times since then. Sometimes I see the figure. Sometimes I don't. Each time I spot it, it's closer. The last time it was so close that I could almost see its face in detail. Its skin looked gray in the truck's headlights. Its clothes were dark and tattered, though I couldn't see any clear rips or dirt. It just looked worn, like it had been out in the elements for years. When it turned its head, its neck moved stiffly, like it was unfamiliar with the motion. I still don't know what it wants. I can't explain how it appears and disappears with no trace. I've tried telling a few people about it, but they laugh it off or say I must be seeing shadows. I know what I've seen, and I know it's real. My body's reaction each time is proof enough for me. My pulse races, my sweat chills, and I get a taste of metal in my mouth like adrenaline hitting my tongue. My mind goes on high alert, and every part of me says there's danger in that fog. Now, whenever I travel at night, I'm on edge. I scan every stretch of road, every drifting patch of fog, always expecting those dull eyes to watch me again. When I pass by other deserted intersections, I feel a spike of dread. But nothing matches that crossroads. That place feels different. The air there seems heavier. The silence has a weight to it. And I never see any other travelers around. Sometimes I park a few miles away and wait until dawn before passing through. It doesn't matter. That figure waits, day or night. I've seen it at dusk and at dawn. I've seen it when the sky was clear and when it was raining. The fog never leaves that intersection, no matter the weather. I don't know if I'm the only one who sees it, but I've never heard anyone else talk about it. Maybe it only shows up for me. I keep driving for work. I can't avoid that route forever, and I can't just quit my job over this. But I've noticed my nerves fraying. My hands shake more often. I'm always tired, like my mind never fully rests. When I get to the crossroads, I grip the wheel so tight my knuckles hurt. I check my mirrors constantly. Sometimes I think about pulling over and demanding answers, but then I remember that feeling of cold air, that numbness, and those eyes. I don't think I have the courage to face it for long. Each time I leave, I notice the figure standing closer to my truck. One of these days, I'm afraid it might reach me before I can drive away. I don't know what that would mean. I don't know if it would grab me or just stare at me, but the thought of it sends waves of panic through my gut. I'm not sure if I could even fight back, or if it would matter. I've heard people talk about places that exist on the edge of our world, where something else bleeds through. I don't have fancy words for it, and I don't want to speculate on why it's here. I just know that it's real, and it's not going away. My best plan is to keep moving, stay aware, and hope it never decides to follow me beyond that crossroads. So that's my story. I don't have a neat ending. I don't have a solution. I just know I'm a solitary traveler on roads most people ignore. And on one forgotten stretch of asphalt, I keep seeing this shape in the fog. It's always there watching me, waiting for me to come back. Its blank eyes lock onto mine, and I feel a drop in my stomach, like I'm falling. Then it vanishes. Every time. I can't shake the feeling that one day it won't vanish. One day it'll stay. And I have no idea what I'll do when that happens. I arrived at the hotel around 7 in the evening, feeling worn out from a long drive and a few unsatisfying meetings. The place was small and close to the highway exit, with a cracked neon sign in front and a gravel parking lot. The clerk at the front desk seemed bored when I walked in. He handed me a key for the top floor room. He said that the regular rooms were full, or at least that's what he told me. I thought it was strange that a place like this would run out of rooms on a random weekday, but I didn't argue. I just needed a bed, a hot shower, and some peace. I walked through a dim hallway and stepped into a small elevator that creaked on the way up. My suitcase wobbled against my leg. The air smelled stale. When I got out on the top floor, the corridor looked darker than the lobby. The wallpaper was peeling. There were no windows in sight, just a single overhead light at the center of the hallway. My room was at the far end. I passed 3 other doors, all locked. Dust covered the doorknobs, and I had the impression that nobody had stepped foot on that floor for a long time. When I opened my door, I noticed a slight draft. The room itself was cramped, with a bed, a nightstand, a small wardrobe, and an old TV mounted on the wall. The bedspread looked clean enough. The carpet had a few stains, but that was normal in a budget hotel. I dropped my suitcase on the bed and felt the tension in my shoulders. The view out the window showed the parking lot below and a strip of the highway. Trucks rumbled by every few minutes. I closed the window to shut out some noise and tried the lights. They flickered but stayed on. I checked the bathroom. It was tight, with only a toilet and a sink, plus a stand-up shower. I turned on the water to see if it ran hot. It did, so I felt relieved. I took a quick shower, changed into clean clothes, and headed back downstairs to ask about dinner options. The clerk was different now, probably the owner. He was a middle-aged man, skinny, with deep lines on his face. He offered me a list of local eateries. I asked if there was anything close by. He said there was a diner 2 miles down the road. I decided to drive there, rather than walk, since the sky was getting dark. On my way out, I casually asked why the top floor seemed so deserted. He shrugged and said it had been closed for renovations, but they never finished the work. Then he told me not to worry. He claimed nobody else was up there, so I'd have the whole floor to myself. After dinner, I came back with a styrofoam box for a late snack. The lobby lights were dimmer than before, but the same man was there, dozing behind the counter. I used the elevator again, and on the way up, I felt a small shudder in the walls. It was probably just an old elevator, but it gave me a slight chill. When I stepped into the hallway, it was silent and dark. I fumbled for the light switch, but the overhead bulb flickered and then died. I used my phone's flashlight to find my room. Once inside, I locked the door. I set the styrofoam box on the nightstand and ate in silence. Then I turned off the lights and tried to sleep. At some point in the night, I woke up to a soft tapping sound. It came from outside my room. The footfalls were regular, like someone pacing back and forth. I sat up and listened. My heart thumped. I waited for the sounds to stop, but they kept going. It was a steady pattern across the hallway floor, like shoes on old wood. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. It was 2:15 in the morning. I got out of bed, walked over to the door, and pressed my ear against it. The tapping continued. I turned the doorknob as quietly as possible and opened the door a crack. The hallway was pitch black. I saw nothing. The sound stopped instantly. I pointed my phone's flashlight into the hallway. I saw the worn carpet and the peeling wallpaper. I smelled something musty. No one was there. I stepped out, feeling the floor groan under my feet. I walked to the middle of the corridor, shining my light around. Everything was still. I wondered if I had imagined the noise, maybe half asleep. The only thing I noticed was a faint odor, almost like burned incense. It reminded me of some strong herbal mixture. After a minute, I gave up and returned to my room. I locked the door and tried to calm down, thinking that old buildings make weird noises. I climbed back into bed and forced myself to rest. In the morning, I woke up feeling sore. I got dressed, took a quick shower, and headed out to my next meeting. While walking down the hallway, I kept noticing a squeaking under my feet. It was the same section where I had heard the pacing the night before. I didn't see any footprints then, but I didn't look too closely either. On my way out, I waved to the owner at the front desk and told him about the footsteps. He stared at me without blinking. Then he said, "Old floors always make noises." That was it. I headed to my car, feeling annoyed. My meetings went fine that day. I tried to forget about the weird incident. I grabbed a quick lunch and worked on my laptop in the car for a while. Around 5 in the afternoon, I returned to the hotel. The sun was still out, but not for long. I decided to inspect the top floor hallway while there was still light. I pressed the elevator button and rode up, listening to the cables creak. When the doors opened, I saw the corridor under the dim overhead lamp. I walked up and down, checking the floor, the walls, even the corners. I didn't see anything unusual other than dust in some spots. The smell of incense was faint but still there, especially near the far corner. I followed that odor until I reached a door that had a sign reading "Storage." It was locked. I felt uncomfortable standing there, so I went back to my room. That evening, I decided to eat in my room again. I bought fast food on the way. My plan was to get through my last day of business in the morning, then drive home. I wanted to leave early. Something about the top floor felt wrong. I couldn't pin it down, but I felt it in my stomach. The air was thick. The silence made me uneasy. I forced myself to stay calm. I watched some cable news on the old TV. Then I lay in bed, but I kept the lights on. Around midnight, the overhead light started to flicker. My eyelids felt heavy, so I reached for the lamp on the nightstand, turned it on, and turned off the ceiling light. Then the footsteps started again. They were slow and methodical, coming from the hallway. My heart pounded. I jumped out of bed. I opened the door fast this time, hoping to catch whoever was out there. Again, I found nothing. The corridor was dark because the overhead light was dead. I used my phone's flashlight. I noticed something on the carpet near the elevator. It was a set of footprints pressed into the dust. They pointed toward my room, but the shoe size looked different from mine. They were bigger, and they had a heavier tread. I stood there feeling the hairs on my neck rise. The footprints led all the way to my door, then seemed to disappear. I searched the carpet, but I couldn't figure out where they ended. The hallway smelled like that incense again, but stronger this time. My eyes watered. I checked the elevator. It was closed and the button was unlit. I started to feel shaky. I went back to my room and closed the door, double locking it. I grabbed a small chair from the corner and propped it under the doorknob. I checked the time. It was about 12:30. I had no plans to leave until daylight, so I stayed up, flipping through channels. Sometimes, I would hear a faint creak outside. I tried to ignore it. I must have dozed off around 2 in the morning because I woke up to the sound of the doorknob rattling. My heart felt like it was going to jump out of my chest. I stared at the door, seeing the chair jammed under the knob. It didn't move, but the knob kept shaking. I yelled, "Who's there?" No answer. I shot out of bed, knocking over my phone. The rattling stopped. I waited a few seconds, then yanked the chair away. I pulled the door open. Nothing. The hallway was dark and empty, but the smell of incense floated right past me. The corridor light near the storage door flickered, then went out. I moved toward that door, shining my phone. I heard a soft scraping sound from inside. It lasted a few seconds, then ended. I stood there, frozen, deciding if I should go downstairs or not. I thought about going to the owner's apartment, but I realized I had no idea where he lived in the building. I didn't feel like waiting for the elevator either. Eventually, I told myself to calm down, go back to the room, and wait out the night. I locked the door again and slid the chair under the knob. My pulse took a while to slow down. I listened, hearing only my breath. The TV kept me company until dawn. In the morning, I hurried to pack up my things. I had one last meeting in town, but I planned to check out right after. The hallway looked ordinary in daylight, though the overhead bulb was still burned out. I examined the carpet where I'd seen footprints, but they were gone. Someone must have vacuumed. I rode the elevator down and found the front desk empty, so I left my key on the counter. On my way out, I saw the owner stepping out of a back office. I told him I was leaving. He asked if everything was okay. I said I heard noises at night. He gave me a blank stare. I mentioned the incense smell. He nodded and said something about old pipes in the walls. Then he reached for the key and tucked it into a drawer. I drove to my meeting, feeling a knot in my stomach. It was hard to focus, but I pushed through. By lunchtime, I was done. I had no reason to stay in that town. I considered telling someone about the strange things on that top floor, but who would believe me? I had no evidence. I just wanted to get out of there. I got in my car and headed for the highway, thinking about the pacing footsteps, the footprints in the carpet, and the locked storage room. I also thought about the incense smell that seemed to trail me in my nightmares. I don't have an explanation for what happened. I know I didn't imagine the footsteps. I heard them, clear as day, on 2 separate nights. I saw footprints that didn't match my shoes. I smelled a strange incense in a place that had been closed off for years. The owner's reaction bothered me. He seemed uninterested, or maybe he was hiding something. But I didn't want to pry. I had no interest in seeing what was in that storage room. It was enough for me to pack up and leave. I drove for hours, stopping only for gas. My mind kept drifting back to that dark corridor. The memory of the doorknob rattling made me cringe. I felt relief when I finally reached the city and saw the tall buildings. My phone buzzed with a few new emails from clients, and that pulled me back into work mode. By the time I got home, I was exhausted. I dragged my suitcase into my apartment and locked my own door, feeling a wave of safety in my own space. That night, I hardly slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined those footprints in the dusty hallway and the smell of that incense. I caught myself jumping at small noises in my apartment, but nothing else happened. After a few days, the tension started to fade. Work kept me busy, and I had no reason to return to that town. I still think about that top floor sometimes. I think about the slow footsteps, the squeaking floor, and the fact that the place had been closed for a long time. Something was there, moving around, leaving footprints behind. Something that only showed itself at night, when the hallways were dark and empty. I have no idea what the owner knew, or what he chose to ignore. I'm just glad I left before anything else happened. If someone asked me about that hotel, I'd tell them it's quiet and cheap, but I'd also tell them to avoid the top floor. I'm not going back. I don't need any more nights with a chair under the doorknob, waiting for morning. That memory is enough. I rented this room because I needed a cheap place close to work. I didn't ask many questions when I moved in. The manager showed me a narrow hallway, peeling wallpaper, and a creaking staircase, and I told him I'd take it. He shrugged and handed me the key. That's how I ended up in this old boarding house. I was tired, and I had to be up early the next day. I decided I'd deal with the stale smell and flickering light in the corridor later. I just wanted a bed and a door that locked. At first, I thought it was fine. Then the night started getting weird. I remember my first night well. The bed frame made a metallic groan any time I shifted my weight. The walls seemed thinner than paper. I heard the person in the next room coughing for hours. Every footstep outside my door seemed louder than it should. I tried to ignore it. In the morning, I got up, splashed some cold water on my face in the communal bathroom, and headed out. I thought everything would be normal, but each day I noticed little things that gave me a sense of unease. The halls felt tighter than they did before. The old wallpaper smelled musty. The overhead lights flickered as if they were about to die. By the time I got back each evening, my shoulders were tense. I tried not to think about it. I told myself I was just exhausted. One night, around 2 in the morning, I was jarred awake by this awful squeaking sound. At first, I thought it was the bed or the floor. But as I sat up, I realized it was coming from one of the wardrobe doors. I keep the wardrobe in the corner near the small window. That night, the top hinge of the left door let out a groan, and I saw the door was slightly open. I was sure I'd closed it before going to sleep, but I assumed maybe I hadn't latched it properly. I got out of bed and walked over. My feet felt heavy on the old wooden boards. I rested my hand on the wardrobe door and pushed it shut. The squeak stopped. I tried pulling it open again just to see if maybe the hinge was loose. It seemed normal. I sighed and went back to bed. I didn't feel anything strange right then, at least not physically, but my mind was racing a bit. I kept thinking about that squeak and the slight draft I felt when I touched the wardrobe handle. After a few minutes, I fell asleep. Around an hour later, I heard the same squeak. I shot up in bed and stared at the wardrobe. The door was open again, maybe an inch. This time I felt a rush of adrenaline. My hands were shaking. I grabbed my phone off the bedside table, turned on the flashlight, and aimed it at the wardrobe. The door was indeed open. I could see the dark space inside. The old wood gave off an earthy smell, like damp soil. I crept over and reached out. I wanted to slam it shut and go back to bed. But when I put my hand on the door, I felt resistance, as if something was pulling from the inside. My heart pounded. I pulled the door with more force. It moved a bit, but I swear it jerked back an inch. I felt my legs tense. I yanked it shut, took a step back, and heard the hinge squeak again. It didn't open this time, but I stood there, hand still on the handle. I was expecting it to fling open or something. Nothing happened. I stood there in my boxers and t-shirt, sweating. The adrenaline made my mouth dry. I finally let go and turned away. I lay in bed for another hour, staring at that wardrobe. I listened for any sound. Eventually, I dozed off without hearing anything else. The next morning, I woke up feeling stiff. My back hurt from the crappy mattress. I checked the wardrobe right away. It was shut. I opened and closed it a few times, trying to recreate the squeak. I could hear it, but it sounded like any old hinge. Nothing felt like it was pulling from the inside. I felt a little stupid. Maybe I was half asleep. But later that night, it happened again. And the night after that. Each time I felt that pull. It was subtle, but it was there. By the third night, I was exhausted. I sat on my bed, rubbing my temples, staring at the wardrobe. I said out loud, "This is insane." Then, a different sound caught my attention. The door across the room, the one leading to the hallway, rattled. I stood up, confused. Nobody knocked. It was just rattling, like someone was jiggling the handle softly. I walked over and put my ear to the door. I could hear footsteps outside, but they were slow and faint. I opened the door. The hallway was empty. The dim ceiling light flickered. My neighbor's door was shut. I closed my door again. Right away, the wardrobe door squeaked. I spun around, almost losing my balance. The door was open an inch again. I cursed under my breath, grabbed it, and slammed it. The moment I did that, the door to the bathroom next to my room squeaked. It was the same squeak, the same pitch. I dashed into the hallway and looked at the bathroom door. It was slightly ajar. Nobody was inside. My arms started to feel heavy. My heart was thudding. I looked back at my room. Now the door to the main closet, where the cleaning supplies were kept, began to creak. The handle turned by itself. It was slow, almost rhythmic. I stepped closer, and the squeaking got louder. The hall smelled like rotting wood. My eyes darted around, expecting someone to pop out. Instead, everything went silent. The closet door clicked shut. Then the wardrobe door back in my room slammed. It made a sharp crack. I nearly jumped out of my skin. I hurried back inside, flipped on my overhead light, and glared at the wardrobe. It sat there, closed. The hinge looked normal. I opened the wardrobe door. Nothing inside but my clothes and a couple of old hangers. I ran my hands along the interior. It felt cold, like the wood had been chilled somehow. I stood there for a minute, breathing heavily. The floor outside in the corridor creaked. I turned and stepped out. The corridor felt narrow, as if the walls had shifted. Every door on the entire floor was slightly ajar. I counted them. 5 doors total, each open an inch or two. A slow breeze came from somewhere, rustling the old wallpaper. The breeze carried a faint squeaking sound, like a series of tiny hinges moving in sequence. My stomach tightened. I walked to the first door on my right. It led to a vacant room. I pushed it open, peered inside, and saw dusty furniture. A single bed, a chair, a little table. No sign of anyone. I closed the door. As soon as I let go of the handle, the second door in the hallway squeaked. My neck prickled. I approached it, opened it, and saw another empty room. This one had an old rocking chair and a small dresser. No one was there. I closed it. The third door squeaked. It felt like something was pulling me along, making me check each door. I went on, opening them one by one. All empty, all musty. Each had some old furniture. Each time I closed a door, the next one squeaked. I felt sweat gathering around my temples. My breathing was uneven. I checked the last door, which was the one at the far end of the hall. That one belonged to a tenant I'd never met. But when I opened it, nobody was inside. The room looked abandoned, with boxes stacked in one corner. A lamp sat on the floor unlit. The bed was stripped of sheets. A stale odor lingered. My skin crawled. It felt like I was intruding. I quickly backed out. I walked back down the hallway. The doors were all shut again. My own door was still open. I stepped inside my room, locked the door, and sat on my bed. I grabbed my phone to check the time. It was almost 3 a.m. I stared at the wardrobe for a long time. Eventually, my body gave in. I lay down, closed my eyes, and tried to rest. I must have drifted off because I woke up to the sound of squeaking again. This time, it was coming from all around me. The wardrobe door was slowly swinging back and forth. My window shutters were rattling. The small bedside table drawer slid out an inch, then slid back. My arms were shaking as I reached for the lamp. I flicked it on. The movement stopped, but the silence afterward was worse. I listened to my own heartbeat. I could taste fear in the back of my throat. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat upright, holding my phone, scanning the room every few minutes. My eyes burned. My back ached. I waited for the sun to come up. As soon as I saw a hint of daylight, I bolted out of the room. I headed downstairs to the lobby. The manager was behind the desk. He looked up, gave me a nod, and went back to reading his newspaper. I approached him and asked, "Do you know if there's something wrong with the doors upstairs? They keep squeaking on their own." He didn't look surprised. He lifted an eyebrow and said, "Old building. Drafts happen. Check the hinges." Then he went back to his newspaper. I stared at him for a moment, frustrated. I wanted to tell him I felt something pulling on the wardrobe door, but I realized how crazy that sounded. I turned around and left for work. That day, I felt a constant heaviness in my chest. I tried focusing on my tasks at the office, but I kept picturing those doors opening on their own. I kept remembering how it felt to pull against that resistance. My boss even asked if I was feeling sick. I lied and said I was fine. After work, I stopped at a hardware store and bought some WD-40, figuring I'd at least fix the squeaking. When I got back, it was already evening. The hallway lights were dim and it smelled like old cooking oil from someone's dinner. I unlocked my room and stepped inside. Everything looked normal, but the air felt stuffy. I switched on the lamp and walked over to the wardrobe. I sprayed the hinges thoroughly, wiped the excess, and opened and shut the door a few times. No squeak. I did the same with my desk drawer, the bed frame joints, and even the window hinges. Satisfied, I locked up and went to brush my teeth. In the bathroom, the flickering light overhead buzzed. The sink had a slow drip. The mirror was cloudy. I brushed my teeth and rinsed my face. Water was cold, and it made me shiver. When I turned off the faucet, I heard the faint squeak again. except now it wasn't coming from inside my room. It was down the hall. I stepped out of the bathroom and saw a door at the very end slowly open. My pulse spiked. I couldn't see into the room. It was dark. I walked toward it, each floorboard creaking under me. The door kept swinging open until it was fully ajar. Then it stopped. I stood in front of the doorway, peering inside. The room was empty, except for a single chair. The lights were off. Something in my gut told me not to go inside. Instead, I stayed in the hallway, trying to breathe quietly. Without warning, the door slammed shut. I jumped back, almost losing my balance. The handle rattled, and I heard the squeak again. It was like it was mocking me. I turned and ran back to my room. Once inside, I locked the door and put the chain on. I leaned against the wall, trying to control my breathing. The entire building felt alive, like every door and every hinge was working together to drive me over the edge. I wiped the sweat off my forehead. My shirt clung to my back. I paced around the room, glancing at the wardrobe. I checked it, still shut. I tapped on the wood. Solid. I pulled it open, rummaged through my clothes, checked the back panel. Everything looked normal. I slammed it shut and waited. No squeak. I opened and closed the desk drawer. Nothing. For a second, I thought maybe the WD-40 had solved the problem. Then the door to the hallway rattled. I stared at it, heart racing. The doorknob jiggled. The chain jangled against the frame. It sounded like someone was trying to force it open, but it wasn't turning fully. I stood frozen, debating whether to open it or stand still. My legs felt weak. The rattling stopped abruptly. My door didn't open. I started to gather my things. I wanted to leave, find a motel, anything. But I only had enough cash on me to make it through the next few days until payday. The rest was in the bank, and I couldn't afford a new place yet. I slumped onto the bed. I hated feeling trapped. I hated feeling like something was in control here. I pulled out my phone and considered calling a friend to ask if I could crash at his place. But it was late, and I wasn't sure how to explain any of this. I decided to stay, at least for the night. I checked the wardrobe again to make sure it was shut tight. Then I sat on the edge of my bed and waited, phone in hand, the light on. The room stayed silent for a long time. I noticed the old radiator hissing in the corner. It clicked and spat occasionally. My eyes grew heavy. My back was tense, but my mind was drained. I leaned against the headboard and tried to stay alert. The overhead light buzzed softly. The hallway outside was quiet. After what felt like hours, I heard a soft squeak on the other side of the wall. Then another, closer. Then a sequence of squeaks, like every door on this floor was opening or closing in some order. It was almost like they were communicating with each other, but I tried not to dwell on that. I just listened, my palms sweaty, my breathing shallow. The squeaks moved down the hall until they reached my door. My knob turned slightly, then released. The chain shook. I gripped my phone, but I didn't move. The squeaking continued down the hall and faded. I swallowed hard. My throat felt tight. I realized I was shaking, but I forced myself to get up and look out the peephole. The corridor was empty, lit only by that weak ceiling light. I could still hear faint squeaking like it was coming from the stairs. I took a deep breath and backed away from the door. I didn't want to follow it again. The last time I'd done that, I ended up with a slamming door inches from my face. I clicked off the overhead light and turned on my small bedside lamp. I decided I would at least try to sleep, keep the door locked, and handle everything in the morning. I crawled under the covers, leaving the lamp on. My eyelids felt heavy, and I kept the phone near my hand. For a while, the only sounds were the radiator and my slow breathing. Then, just as I was drifting off, I heard a gentle creak from the wardrobe. I shot upright, heart pounding. The door was opening again, an inch at a time. I could see the darkness inside. I clenched my fists. My legs felt numb. I couldn't move for a few seconds. Then I swung my legs off the bed and marched over to it, determined to keep it shut. When I grabbed the handle, it fought me again, that same pull from before. I put my full weight into it. The wood pressed back. Finally, I managed to slam it shut. The moment it closed, I heard squeaking from the hallway. It was the same pattern, the same echo. Every door out there was responding in some way. I leaned against the wardrobe, panting. My mind was in overdrive. I thought about leaving right then, but I felt pinned in place by fatigue and fear. Instead, I pulled the wardrobe away from the wall a few inches. I wedged a chair between the door of the wardrobe and the desk, hoping that would keep it from opening. Then I grabbed my bag, stuffed some essentials in it, and set it next to the bed in case I decided to bolt. I lay back down, every muscle tense. The squeaking in the hallway stopped. The building fell silent again, except for the occasional drip in the sink. My hands trembled for a while. I tried to focus on the reality of the room, the worn carpet, the stained walls, the flickering lamp. Eventually, exhaustion got the better of me. My eyes closed. That's when I felt another rattle against the wardrobe. The chair shook, the desk budged. A chill ran down my spine. I whispered to myself, "Enough." I jumped out of bed, grabbed my bag, and unlocked the door. I stepped out into the corridor. All the doors were closed, but I sensed they could open any second. I walked quickly to the stairs, ignoring the creaks under my feet. I could hear a faint squeaking behind me, like one door just started to open. I descended to the lobby, feeling my pulse in my ears. The manager was gone. The front desk was empty. I slipped out into the street, feeling the cool night air hit my face. I didn't have a plan, but I knew I couldn't stay in that room another minute. I headed down the sidewalk, my bag slung over my shoulder, not looking back. I just wanted distance. My heart still hammered and my arms felt weak, but I kept walking, focusing on each step. I thought about the wardrobe, the chair I left wedged against it, and that final squeak echoing in my ears. I knew I wasn't going back, not after what I'd seen and heard. I never learned exactly why those doors acted that way. I didn't ask any more questions. I just walked away that night and found a couch to crash on at a coworker's apartment. The next day, I called the manager and told him I was moving out. He didn't ask why. He just said I owed for the week. I paid him and never set foot in that building again. Even now, I still think about the feeling of something pulling on the other side of that wardrobe door. That place had a presence. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't something I could live with. So I left. I'm certain it still stands there with its narrow halls and decaying wallpaper, waiting for the next person who needs a cheap place to stay. Maybe they'll ignore the strange sounds at first, but eventually, the doors will call to them the same way they called to me. I still remember the first time I saw that old radio. It was sitting on a wooden table in the back of a dusty antique store. The owner kept telling me about the radio's unusual background. He said it dated back to the 1940s, with bulky vacuum tubes and a heavy wooden frame. I was intrigued by its shape and the faded label on the front panel. I ran my hand along the scratched surface and felt a jolt of excitement. I collect rare electronics, so I wasn't about to let this one slip away. The price was a bit high, but the owner insisted it had strange properties. He gave me a tense grin when he mentioned that. I paid without asking too many questions. Part of me loved the mystery. I carried the radio to my car and set it on the passenger seat. I glanced at its knobs and dials. The tuning knob felt a little stiff when I tested it. The volume knob creaked with every turn. As I drove home, I caught myself looking over at it, half expecting it to spark or hum on its own. It was just silent and still, but I couldn't shake the idea that something lurked inside that wooden case. The night was cool, and my car's headlights lit the lonely road ahead. The radio remained quiet, though the antique store owner's words stayed in my mind. When I got home, I carried it inside. I live in a small house near the edge of town. My living room is full of shelves stacked with old cameras, tape recorders, and all sorts of vintage electronics. The radio looked right at home among my other collections. I set it on a side table near the window, plugged it into a power strip, and flipped the switch. For a moment, nothing happened. Then I heard static. I twisted the tuning knob slowly, listening to the crackle. I expected to pick up some old AM station or maybe get a faint signal from a faraway broadcaster. Instead, I only heard that constant hiss. I leaned closer. The static wavered, then popped. I felt a slight prickle on the back of my neck. I tried adjusting the antenna. I tried moving the radio a little, but the static continued. Then I heard a faint whisper through the noise. It was so quick that I almost missed it. My name, buried under the static. I froze. The whisper was frantic, like someone was out of breath. The voice was garbled, but I recognized my name in that jumble of sound. My heart pounded. I stared at the glowing tubes inside the case. I didn't hear anything else. I wondered if I imagined it. I switched the radio off. My hand shook. I wiped the sweat from my forehead and tried to steady my breathing. I told myself it had to be a trick of the mind, just random interference or some weird shortwave overlap. The moment passed and I shrugged it off as a glitch. I left the radio unplugged for the rest of the night. I felt a little uneasy, but I didn't let it bother me too much. I went to bed with the intention of checking the radio again the next day. The next night I was brushing my teeth around 11. I started to hear a faint noise in the living room. At first I thought it was the pipes or the wind outside, but the sound got louder. It was static but deeper, almost growling. I spat out the toothpaste and walked down the hallway. The radio was glowing. I was certain I had unplugged it. Yet there it was, tubes lit up behind the cloth speaker. The volume was up, blasting static. I felt a jolt of shock and a wave of fear spread through my chest. I rushed to the outlet and found the power cable attached. I had no idea how that happened. I pulled the plug. The radio went dark. My hands trembled, and I heard my own breath coming out in quick bursts. I felt my legs quiver as I tried to think logically. Maybe I forgot that I plugged it back in. Maybe I was tired and missed some detail. I carried the radio to another room, an old storage space I rarely use, and placed it on a metal shelf. I left it unplugged. I closed the door, locked it, and went to bed. I wanted to ignore the weirdness and get some sleep. At midnight, I shot up in bed. I heard muffled static again. It sounded faint at first, but then it grew louder like a rising wave of noise. I flipped on the light and stared at my bedroom door. My heart pounded. I swung my feet onto the floor and stood. The static sounded distorted, and I caught a hint of voices underneath it. They were low and jumbled, like they were talking over each other. I left my bedroom and walked toward the storage room. The door was still locked. The static poured out from behind the door, so loud now that I could feel it in my chest. I unlocked the door, flipped the light switch, and saw the radio on the shelf. It was plugged in, even though I was sure I left the cord on the floor earlier. Its tubes glowed orange, and the speaker cloth vibrated with the sounds. I felt the hair on my arm stand on end. My fingers tingled. My stomach tightened. I heard a sudden series of bangs from inside the radio, like someone was tapping on the wooden casing from within. I moved closer, but the static overwhelmed everything. Then the volume dipped, and I heard those voices again. They were disjointed. One voice rasped words I couldn't understand. Another hissed like it was in pain. Then a separate voice said my name. It demanded something, but I couldn't catch every word. It was like, "Answer, answer me." My eyes watered from the tension. I yanked the plug out of the power strip. The static died instantly. I carried the radio outside. It was past midnight and the sky was overcast. I set the radio down on my small back patio. I wanted to leave it out there. I wanted to stop dealing with this crazy thing. But I worried about rain or morning dew damaging it. Part of me still cared that it was a collectible. So I grabbed a large box from my garage, placed the radio inside, and tucked it under an awning so it wouldn't get wet. Then I went inside, locked the door, and tried to calm down. I sat on my couch trying to catch my breath. My heart was still racing. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. I stared at the door, worried that I'd hear that static again. I forced myself to turn on the TV to distract me. I watched some late-night program, but my mind stayed fixed on the radio. The voices had sounded so real. They had a desperation that felt raw and immediate. My skin tingled and my palms were sweaty. Eventually, I dozed off in front of the TV. I woke up around 5 in the morning. My neck was stiff and my eyes burned. I got up, turned off the TV, and peeked outside. The box was still under the awning, and it looked untouched. I felt a small surge of relief. Maybe I could return the radio to that antique store. Maybe I could sell it to another collector. I kept telling myself it was just a short circuit or some bizarre electrical issue. But I couldn't ignore the clear way my name had been spoken. I didn't want to believe something unexplainable was happening, yet I had no rational explanation. Later that day, I tried testing the radio in my garage. I used a different outlet. It didn't turn on by itself. I plugged it in, flipped the switch, and heard only the usual static. No voices, no tapping. I stood there for an hour, fiddling with the knobs. Nothing. I felt both relieved and frustrated. I wondered if my mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe I was just tired when I heard all that. I carried the radio back into the house. This time I placed it on a high shelf near my other antique gadgets. I left it unplugged, coiled the power cord neatly, and tried to ignore it for the rest of the evening. That night, I woke up to a loud crashing sound in the living room. My eyes flew open. My heart raced. I jumped out of bed and sprinted down the hall. The radio was on the floor upside down. The shelf above it was bare. All my other devices were untouched. I checked the radio's cord. It was plugged in again. The tubes glowed faintly. The speaker crackled. I felt a wave of cold sweat break across my forehead. My hands shook as I tried to lift the radio. It was heavier than usual. Then the speaker emitted a piercing screech. I dropped the radio back onto the floor. My chest felt tight, and my pulse pounded. I looked around to see if anything else in the room was disturbed. Nothing else was out of place. The screech stopped, replaced by a thin wave of static. I forced myself to pick the radio up again. I placed it on a table, but the moment I did, the static changed to harsh whispers. They were so distorted that I could barely pick out any real words. Then I heard my name again, followed by what sounded like instructions or demands. I couldn't make them out. I pressed my ear closer, but the volume spiked and I jerked back. A trickle of sweat dripped down the side of my face. I felt my throat tighten. My mind raced. I paced around the room. I unplugged the radio, but the tube stayed lit for a few seconds before they faded. When they finally went dark, I exhaled. I was drained and furious. I couldn't understand why this kept happening. I unplugged every electronic in my house, hoping to stop any chance of interference. I even flipped some breakers off, leaving only essential power on. I put the radio in my garage, deep in a corner near some dusty shelves. I left it there and went back inside. My entire body felt stiff. My breathing was shallow. I locked every door behind me. Over the following nights, the radio turned on by itself, always around midnight. It didn't matter if it was in the garage or in a locked closet. It would show up somewhere else, always plugged in, always broadcasting those horrifying noises. The static was accompanied by moans and distant screams. Sometimes I heard scraping sounds like someone dragging something heavy across concrete. My name came through more clearly each time. It was always followed by words I couldn't fully grasp. I slept less and less. My eyes were red and my nerves were shot. My thoughts revolved around the radio. I couldn't eat a normal meal without thinking about those voices. My heart pounded every time the clock struck midnight. My stomach twisted in knots. I started to feel like the radio wanted me to respond. The voices kept telling me to listen, or answer, or respond. Their tone was urgent, sometimes angry. Whenever I tried talking back to the radio, it fell silent. Then, as soon as I walked away or tried to unplug it, the voices returned, louder than before. I felt cornered by it. I didn't know what it wanted. I tried smashing the radio with a hammer one night, but the wooden case only cracked a bit. The tubes rattled inside, but it remained intact. I felt foolish for hitting it, but my frustration had boiled over. In desperation, I tried taking the radio to a local electronics repair shop. The technician examined it and noted that some wiring looked corroded, but otherwise it was just a vintage set with typical wear. I didn't mention the strange behavior. He replaced a few parts, but the next midnight the same thing happened. Static. Whispers. My name. I felt a numb panic settle in. My home no longer felt safe. I began putting the radio outside each night. I placed it on the far edge of my backyard behind a low fence near some bushes. I would stand on my porch and watch it. At exactly midnight, the tubes glowed. The static hissed. Then I heard screams that made my hair stand on end. They were muffled, like hearing them through thick walls. The voices grew frantic. I covered my ears, but the sound seemed to penetrate everything. I ran inside, locked the door, and hid under a blanket. It didn't help. The screams didn't stop until around 12:30 in the morning. When I finally went back outside, the radio was dark and the cord was still coiled neatly beside it. But I felt shaky and cold, even though the night was warm. I tried ignoring it for a while. I stayed at a friend's place for a couple of nights, but part of me felt guilty about leaving my house like that. When I returned, the radio was on my kitchen table. The friend I stayed with had no key, so I had no clue how it ended up there. The radio's case was scratched, and the speaker fabric was torn in one corner. But it was silent. I stood there for a long time, just staring at it. My legs felt weak, and I had this hollow ache in my chest. I wanted to smash it to pieces, I wanted to set it on fire, but I couldn't do it. Something in me still cared about the fact that it was a rare piece. And maybe I was afraid that even that wouldn't stop it. The antique shop owner's grin flashed through my mind. I realized he must have known. I wondered how long that radio had tormented him, or how many hands it had passed through before reaching mine. I could almost imagine the chain of people who tried to rid themselves of it. I decided to seal the radio in a large plastic container, wrap it with duct tape, and store it in my attic. The attic access is in my hallway ceiling. I pulled down the folding ladder, hauled the container up, and placed it in the far corner, behind boxes of old clothes and junk. I took my time, making sure it was as buried as possible. I left it there. Then I carefully locked the attic door from below. For a week, things stayed quiet. I slept better. I got back into a routine. I even considered selling some of my other antiques. I didn't want another experience like this. I stopped visiting new shops. I avoided auctions. I tried to forget about the radio entirely. But on the 8th night, I woke at midnight. A familiar hum drifted down from the attic. I squeezed my eyes shut and hoped it was a dream. The hum rose to a harsh buzz. My teeth vibrated. I got out of bed and opened the attic door. The hum poured out in a wave of static. I climbed the ladder, flicked the light on, and saw that the container was tipped over. The duct tape was ripped open, and the radio was powered on. I saw the faint glow of the vacuum tubes, the reflection on the wooden beams. My stomach churned. My legs felt weak. I stepped toward it. The static dulled, and the whispering took over. My name, repeated over and over, interspersed with hissing and clicking. I reached out with a trembling hand. My mouth felt dry. My heart hammered against my ribs. I lifted the radio and carefully turned the volume knob. The whisper turned into a hiss. The hiss turned into garbled commands. My head ached. My ears rang. I brought the radio downstairs again, stepping carefully so I wouldn't drop it. I placed it on my kitchen counter. It was still plugged in somehow. I stared at the cord. I didn't know where it led. I looked behind me, but I saw no outlet in use. Yet the tubes glowed and the speaker hissed. I bit my lip and felt a trickle of blood on my tongue. My mind spun. I'm still not sure why I keep that radio. Maybe I hope I'll figure out how to shut it down for good. Maybe some part of me is drawn to it despite the terror it brings. I can't explain it in logical terms. Every night at exactly midnight, it switches on. Every night I hear the static, the voices, the screams. I can't break it. I can't outrun it. It shows up wherever it wants. No matter where I hide it or lock it away, it finds a way to power up and call to me. I never hear anything after 12:30. It always stops on its own. But the next night, the cycle begins again. My hands keep shaking every time I see the first sign of that glow. My neck stiffens, my muscles tense, my breath gets shallow, and I brace myself for the noise. Each time, the radio demands a response. Each time, I stand there, paralyzed. I have no idea what it wants me to say. I only know I'm stuck with it, at least for now. And every midnight, I wonder if this will be the night it finally tells me something I can understand. I felt the tension in my stomach the moment I stepped off the main road and headed into that forest. The tall trees blocked most of the sunlight, and the air smelled of wet leaves and moss. I wasn't in the mood for city noises and traffic anymore. I had a tent in my pack and a solid pair of boots on my feet. My plan was simple: hike deeper than usual, find a quiet spot to set up camp, and forget about everything for a while. I didn't expect to find the old cabin on my first day. When I saw it, I froze. It looked empty at first, with broken window panes and a crooked porch, but I got this prickling on the back of my neck. Something felt off, and I couldn't put my finger on it. I decided to take a closer look. I stepped through some dense undergrowth and made my way to the cabin. The wooden boards on the outside looked soaked and warped. The door was cracked open, and it made a small creaking sound when the wind blew. I paused. I could see footprints in the soft dirt around the side. At first I thought they might be mine, but they were bigger than my boots. They formed a clear path toward the back of the cabin. I stood there, a bit uneasy, not sure if I should call out or keep quiet. Eventually I decided to walk around, but I didn't shout or make any noise. I wanted to see if anyone was there without drawing attention. I circled the place. The back door was in worse shape than the front. Broken hinges, rotted planks, and a patch of fresh ashes near a makeshift fire pit. I squatted and touched the ashes. They were cold, but the chunks of wood looked recently burned. There were some old cans tossed nearby. The labels were faded, but I could see some rust flakes. It looked like someone had eaten there not too long ago. The footprints around the fire pit matched the ones near the front. That was enough for me to realize this place wasn't as abandoned as it looked. I felt a rush of adrenaline. I wasn't sure if I should go inside. My heart thudded. I told myself I wasn't trespassing because I thought the cabin was abandoned. But what if the person who used this place came back? I decided to peek through one of the windows. I had to climb onto a small stack of rocks to see through the broken glass. Inside it was dark, but I could make out a table. The top was covered in dust, except for a few clear patches. It looked like someone had moved things around. There were chairs overturned, but one chair stood upright near the window. I couldn't see any sign of life at that moment, so I hopped down and thought about what to do next. I wasn't comfortable setting up camp right next to this strange cabin, but something pulled me back. A small voice in my head told me to stay nearby and keep an eye on it. I don't know why I listened. Maybe I was curious. Maybe I was bored. I hiked about half a mile away and found a flat area near a shallow creek. I set up my tent there. The sounds of the forest were normal at first: rustling leaves, the occasional snap of a twig, and the trickle of water. I tried to relax, but I kept thinking about that cabin. I kept picturing those footprints and the cold ashes in the fire pit. After dark, I built a small campfire of my own and warmed up some canned soup. The forest was quiet, but I had this sensation in my gut that someone was watching. Every now and then I turned my head, scanning the trees. The only light I had was from the flames and my flashlight. I caught glimpses of shapes among the branches, but usually it was just the wind pushing leaves. I heard an owl hooting in the distance, and that made me jump a bit. Around midnight, I decided to put out the fire and crawl into my tent. Sleeping was tough. I could barely keep my eyes closed. My mind kept replaying the footprints around that old place. I kept imagining a figure creeping through the darkness toward my tent. The next day, I woke up with a stiff neck. I unzipped my tent and looked around. Everything seemed still. The forest smelled crisp in the early morning air. I brewed some coffee on my camp stove. then decided to head back to the cabin. I followed the same route as before. As I got closer, I noticed something new. The front door, which had been slightly open, was now shut. It wasn't just nudged closed by the wind. It looked like someone had actually pushed it until it latched. That fact gave me a sudden jolt. I made my way to the side window and looked in again. The chair that had been near the window was now pushed over to the table. There was a piece of cloth on it. It looked like a torn shirt sleeve or a rag. I leaned in and squinted. I didn't see anyone inside. I decided to try the door. It opened without much effort. The inside smelled damp and the floorboards creaked under my weight. Dust floated in the light that came through the cracks in the walls. On the table, I noticed an old lantern and a few melted candle stubs. There was a small stack of newspapers on the floor, but they were torn and moldy. I took a few steps further in. The cabin had 2 rooms, the main room where I stood, and a smaller room in the back. I could see the opening to it, but it was dark. The door to that room was halfway closed. I felt sweat forming on my forehead. My breath caught in my throat. I stood still and listened. I heard a faint tapping noise. It sounded like it came from the other room. I felt my pulse quicken. I whispered, "Hello?" but got no response. The tapping stopped. My stomach churned. I thought about turning around and leaving right then, but I forced myself to move. My boots squeaked on the old floor. I reached the doorway to the second room and peeked inside. It was smaller than I expected. There was a narrow bed frame with no mattress, just some springs and rotting fabric. There was a window on the far wall, and it was missing a pane of glass. The wind made it rattle. That must have been the tapping sound I heard. Relieved, I exhaled. The tapping had a logical explanation. I checked the corners of the room. Nothing but dust and a broken chair. Then I heard a sudden thump outside. It sounded close, like something had hit the porch. My muscles tensed and I felt my hands clench. My mouth went dry. I backed out of the room and walked toward the front door. I tried not to make any noise, but the boards groaned under me. When I reached the door, I stopped and looked out through the gap. I didn't see anyone, but I heard a rustle in the bushes. It was a brief sound, then silence. I took a quick step onto the porch. My heart pounded in my ears. I stared at the tree line, scanning for movement. Nothing stood out. I stepped down off the porch and saw fresh footprints again. This time, they seemed to circle the cabin. I looked at them closely. They weren't mine. I could see the pattern of a different boot sole. I followed them a few yards and they disappeared into the thicker brush. I felt uneasy, almost nauseous. I realized I wasn't alone out there. Someone else was wandering around, hiding whenever I got close. I walked back to my camp, my eyes darting left and right. Every snapping twig made me flinch. By the time I reached my tent, I was sweating. I checked my gear. Everything was where I left it. No signs of intrusion. I told myself maybe I should pack up and leave, but I felt this strange urge to stay. I wanted answers. I wanted to see who was lurking near that cabin. That evening, I decided to set up a simple watch. I found a spot behind a cluster of rocks about 50 yards from the cabin. The area gave me a partial view of the porch. I settled in with my binoculars, which I always carry. Dusk fell, and the sky turned a dull gray. The forest got quiet again, except for the occasional distant chirp of insects. I started to shiver. The temperature dropped fast. I pulled my jacket tight and stayed still. After about an hour, I saw a flicker of movement near the side of the cabin. I raised my binoculars. I could make out a shape, probably a person. They wore dark clothes and moved with caution. They slowly approached the cabin's side window. I heard my heartbeat pounding in my eardrums. The figure paused, then pushed the window open and slipped inside. I felt a wave of adrenaline. I wanted to call out, but something told me to wait. I stayed in my spot for what felt like half an hour. Then a light turned on inside the cabin, a faint glow. Maybe it was that lantern I'd seen. Shadows flickered across the window. I took a deep breath and decided to move closer. I got up quietly and crept forward, holding my flashlight in one hand and a small pocket knife in the other. My pulse raced with every step. Dry leaves crunched under my boots and I tried to step lightly. As I neared the porch, I heard movement inside. Floorboards creaked and something scraped across the floor. I felt my mouth go dry again. I wanted to see who this person was, but I was also terrified. My body felt tense and rigid. I reached the front door. It was shut, but a sliver of light peeked through the gap. I heard a low voice inside, muttering something. I couldn't make out the words. My palms were clammy. I slowly turned the doorknob and pushed. The door opened a crack. I saw the glow of the lantern on the table. There was a person standing near the fireplace, their back to me. They had a hood pulled up. Their shoulders were broad and they seemed tall. They moved a crate across the floor. I accidentally nudged the door too far and it made a loud creak. The person spun around. Their face was in shadow because of the hood. They froze for a second, then lunged for the lantern. I panicked. I lifted my flashlight and aimed it, trying to see clearly. I shouted, "Wait!" My voice shook. The person grabbed the lantern and dashed toward the back room. I bolted inside, stumbling over a broken chair. I nearly dropped my flashlight. When I looked up, the back door was slamming shut. By the time I reached it, the person was gone. I heard footsteps outside, fading into the forest. My hands trembled. I could feel my heart pounding in my throat. For a moment, I just stood there, breathing hard. I decided to check what they had been messing with. The crate looked old. The boards were nailed shut, except for one corner where the nails were pried loose. Inside, I saw a bunch of tools, some rusted knives, a crowbar, and a hammer. Nothing looked new. I turned around and noticed a piece of paper on the table. It had some scribbled writing on it, but I couldn't read it in the dim light. I reached for the lantern, which was left behind. It had a small amount of fuel, and the flame was still going. I lifted it and held it over the paper. The writing was messy. It looked like a list of items: rope, nails, wire, tarps. Then there were lines scratched out like someone had changed their plan. I felt uneasy. Why would someone hide this list? I heard a muffled noise outside. I spun around, the lantern shaking in my grip. The shadows on the wall danced. I walked slowly to the front door again. The forest outside was pitch black. I aimed my flashlight, but I didn't see any sign of the person. I stood there, my skin crawling, my muscles tight. The silence felt heavy. I took a deep breath and grabbed the paper, folding it and shoving it in my pocket. I needed to get out of there. I hurried back to my campsite. The walk felt longer in the dark. Every shift of a branch made me grip my flashlight tighter. I glanced behind me every few steps, convinced I might see that hooded figure. My throat felt dry, and I was covered in sweat by the time I reached my tent. I fumbled with the zipper and ducked inside. I couldn't calm down. My hands kept shaking. I sat on my sleeping bag and thought about what I'd seen. There was a person living in that cabin, or at least using it. They had tools, a list, and they ran away the moment they noticed me. Why hide? I stayed awake most of the night, shining my flashlight around every time I heard a twig snap. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I dozed off. When I woke up the next morning, I felt stiff and anxious. I got out of my tent and looked around. My campsite was undisturbed, but I had this feeling like I was being watched. I cranked up my stove and made some coffee. My hand shook as I poured it into my cup. I planned to pack up and leave, but I felt drawn to that cabin again. My curiosity was stronger than my fear. Around mid-morning, I grabbed my gear and walked back toward the cabin, but with caution. I moved slowly, stopping every so often to listen. The forest was still. When I reached the edge of the clearing, I crouched behind a thick tree trunk. The front door of the cabin hung open, swinging gently in the breeze. That made my heart pound. I waited for a while, scanning the windows. After several minutes, I stood up and approached. I stepped onto the porch, half expecting someone to leap out. Nothing happened. The inside looked empty at a glance. The lantern was gone from the table, and the crate was also missing. I walked around the cabin looking for footprints. I saw fresh ones leading away from the back door, heading deeper into the forest. I decided not to follow them. My gut told me I wasn't prepared for what might happen if I did. Instead, I stepped inside one more time. The place felt colder than before. The list of supplies I had taken was still in my pocket. Without the lantern, it was too dark to see much, but I noticed the floor was swept clear in one area, near the fireplace. Someone had cleaned up in a hurry. I realized this wasn't just a random squatter. They had some sort of plan, and I was in the way. I felt a chill run through my arms. I left quickly. My pulse didn't settle down until I was back on the main trail. I decided to cut my trip short. That forest didn't feel safe anymore, and I didn't want to confront whoever that was. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was never alone from the moment I set foot near that cabin. Even as I walked out of the woods, I heard faint snapping branches behind me. I kept looking over my shoulder, but I never caught another glimpse of the hooded figure. By the time I reached my car, I felt drained. My clothes were damp with sweat and my legs were sore. I just climbed in, locked the doors, and gripped the steering wheel. My heart was still racing. I left that place, but I can't stop thinking about it. I can still picture the footprints around the fire pit, the cold ashes, and the shadowy figure slipping into the cabin. I can still feel the jolt in my chest when the front door creaked open under my hand. Every time I recall that scene, I feel the tightness in my chest. Something about that forest and that cabin feels wrong. I'm not sure I want to go back, but there's a part of me that craves an explanation. Right now, I can't find one. All I know is that whoever is out there doesn't want people snooping around, and I was snooping too much. I doubt I'll ever forget the way my stomach twisted when I heard those steps outside. It's a feeling that's going to stay with me, no matter how long I try to push it away.